to see the brilliant writing that Judy has put together. You can see one of her articles that's in the Starbrook News, and I'll drop it in the chat where you can kind of understand where Judy is coming from in terms of her presentation today, what she's been through, what she's been doing in terms of helping and holding up the community in Stubbs, but also across the island. And I'm really, really happy to be able to join Judy today. And Judy, can you hear me? I'm just gonna make sure that you're not muted, because let's see. So I just had it. So what Judy had let me know, sorry, we're just trying to figure out the logistics right now. Because Judy had let me know earlier, she sent me a message saying that the weather in St. Vincent was really, really rough right now in terms of the rain, and the internet might not be able to support the video. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna be able to check in with Judy. I'm gonna put up a graphic so that people can see what's here, but I just wanted to hear, Judy, if you're on the line right now and you're able to hear us. Okay, so she's calling me right now. We're in the middle of something, so let's see. Sorry, 1 second.
Myself.
Okay, I think, yeah, we needed to, thank you, Michaela. I think you unmuted Judy. So Judy, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Were you able to hear a little bit of what I had said before?
Yes, I did. I actually heard everything that you said.
Okay, so
on gas here, we can go.
yeah. Okay, so what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna share my screen and I'm gonna pull up the PowerPoint, just the slide that's here for everyone to see. And if just people can yell at me once it works. Can people see that? Is the slide up or no?
Yep, the slide is there.
Okay, thank you.
I can't see, but.
Okay, Judy, so we have the slide up, and the title for your talk is Building Bridges Out of Le Soufriere Ashes, Some Notes on the Displacement in the Wake of the Volcanic Eruption in St. Vincent. So the graphics that you had sent over in terms of the red zone map and the map of St. Vincent were overlaid over the map of St. Vincent. And we also have a picture of the explosion as seen from Kingstown.
Okay, great. That's cool. That's excellent. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much, for this privilege and opportunity to speak with you today about our current condition here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and St. Vincent specifically, and in Stubbs currently. And where I'm speaking to you from in Stubbs, this is my home place, and where we have 2 shelters housing over 200 displaced residents. And just for context, these displaced residents have been displaced from areas designated as the so-called red zone, so close to the volcanic mountain. And if you look on the map, it's gonna be the areas of, say, Sandy Bay, Oia, Fancy, and Georgetown, etc., that you can see on the map on the windward side. So on the Atlantic side of the map, that's where I'm located. I'm in the green zone of Stubbs. And in Stubbs, we have a government school or primary school where I attended as a child. That is one of our shelters. And about 10 minutes away, we also have another shelter at the Sinclair Dakin Secondary School. Now, the residents of these shelters are predominantly our indigenous people who have been displaced from these so-called red zones, so our Kalinagos and Garifuna people. As Kevin said, my name is Judy Grant, and I am a 4th-year PhD candidate. I'm in the Leadership, Higher and Adult Education Department at OISE with a collaborative specialization in women and gender studies. And my research emerges from my own embodied knowledge and experience of migration movements as a set of arrivals and returns, as a Black migrant Vincentian woman living in Toronto and working as a police officer for almost 17 years. And on March 15th, I returned to St. Vincent for a family emergency and has been holding in place since due to the global pandemic of COVID-19 and its various and multiple restrictions by the government, airlines, etc. And what I can say is that the last year has been profoundly transformational for me in many, many ways. And being a part of this crisis and the possibilities that it has laid bare has helped to profoundly shift my own life, and even the dissertation that I swore I was going to be defending at the end of August, but it's going to shift, which is brilliant and beautiful. I'm not deterred though, I am very much excited about that. Today, what I want to do is just to talk to you briefly about my firsthand experiences of this crisis, the response from our communities in struggle, and the challenges and possibilities for rebuilding even stronger and more differently here in St. Vincent. And the fact is, these are the facts that the volcano erupted and has caused damage to infrastructure. It has resulted in an estimated 20,000 people being evacuated from their homes, 3,000 displaced into shelters, and a chronic water shortage, contamination of even clean water supplies, which impacted profoundly individuals, families, our culture here, and potentially contributing to more global health dilemmas. Fact is, most of the displaced residents in the shelter, as I've said, are indigenous peoples, the Kalinagos and Garfunas, whose communities have been destroyed. Many have lost their homes and their livelihoods. Fact is, many of these residents are women, and we have approximately 55 children between the two residents combined that I usually attend and volunteer my services almost daily. Fact is, COVID-19, the global health crisis is here, and we simply do not have the infrastructure to deal with a severe outbreak. But fact is, we are also very hopeful. Fact is, beside this immediate crisis of the volcano erupting, the ongoing crisis of dengue fever that is in our wake, COVID-19 and the disproportionate poverty. Indeed, almost half of the population here live under the poverty line. All of these combined are wreaking havoc on the lives of those of us here in St. Vincent who are not privileged to be above those lines. And so my obsession since I've been here and in viewing this crisis and the struggles that we continue to confront, I have been really, really obsessed with the possibilities that I have borne witness to and participated in. So let us go through the events. The eruption occurred on April the 9th at approximately 8:41. And within minutes of the first explosion, darkness accompanied by thick ashes began to envelop our small island of St. Vincent and my tiny village of Stubbs. Stubbs is located, as I said, in the so-called green zone and is considered a safe space. It was dreadful, this experience, and it was chaotic. What I find useful and quite powerfully so were my previously policing experiences of rapid response to emergencies, including major incident response. I connected with a local organizer, her name is Marsha, and I wrote about it in the piece that Kevin mentioned earlier, and thank you so much, Kevin, for referencing that. And we began to mobilize efforts for displaced residents. I mean, my uncle was shouting out that there are people down at the shelter at Stubbs, and right away I got dressed and I had out a lot of ash. It reminded me, eerily enough, of snow in Toronto. But community residents in Stubbs, what I witnessed, and the surrounding areas just began to show up with food and supplies, sanitary products, care packages for displaced residents, Pampers for babies, etc. Some women were coming with the flat pot full of food, others were coming with ground provision, sacks of rice, and anything else, because what I realized was that there was a clear lack of preparation or preparedness, for that matter of fact. And this was disturbing given that the volcano was erupted effusively since December 2020. I mean, some residents got the evacuation order or message late, and some were still trying to make their way out of the red zones in the days after the first major eruption. I recall a Garifuna woman and her husband describing leaving on a four-wheel bicycle through thick ashes. She highlighted the consideration of some motorists who slowed down and turned on their high beams to guide them and juxtapose it with the speeding vehicles of those who did not. The faithful red four-wheel bike took its last breath upon arrival at the shelter. The batteries died. The shelter residents are now in the process of mobilizing where I'm volunteering. They're empowered and are empowering each other to take charge of their new home space as they come to grips with the realities of their lives now turned upside down by this disaster. The water became a huge problem in the immediate aftermath of the first eruption. There was a significant shortage of clean water supply. And this made us predominantly depend on clean water from outside of the island. So we had like cruise ships coming in with water that eventually folks will go and pump the water from the ships and bring them into the community to distribute. But this did not happen right away. This happened like 2 to 3 days after the initial eruption, which was really, really difficult. And as we know, inadequate clean water supply and sanitation stations are things that, you know, even thinking forward that we're gonna need in order to prevent the spread of, you know, health-related symptoms and diseases such as dengue and everything else. Plus, as I said, and we know we have the COVID-19 global disaster and health crisis. So there was a damaged water catchment in our area. It has since been repaired though, and we're getting clean, over-purified chlorine water. And we also have a lot of natural springs here in St. Vincent, and that was really, really helpful. Because during the immediate response of due to the water shortage, I was able to collaborate with a Kuwait-based construction company that is operating out of Grenada. And I teamed up with one of the project coordinators, and we began to pump water from the river next door, like to these shelters, to flush and to wash down some of the ash because there was just so much ash. We have residents who have underlying health issues such as asthma and stuff like that. So cleaning up the space was really important, and also flushing, like that became a huge, huge issue. And so we were able to do that through collaborating with this construction company. And they were also able to go to the natural springs to pump fresh water and then distribute to the shelters, and then the shelters in the community, because the shelters extend from the school into the homes of residents in Stubbs and surrounding areas. Indeed, my neighbor has about 6 women next door who are staying from the leeward side, the red zone. They have been displaced. So we do provide resources for these folks also. And one of the things that we were able to do, so that was the water issue. We have water now, it is running. And today we have so much water because the clouds opened up. They burst open this morning with a thunderous roar that woke me up, and my dog and I got very excited. The dog started to howl. It was so dreadful. I thought that the volcano had erupted again. But apparently it was the sounds of thunder, and then there what's called a lahar flowing. So lahars are a mix of like mud and soil and stones and gravel, fallen trees, and it takes everything in its wake as it makes its way down the mountain and into the Atlantic Ocean on our side here. So that is now a major issue as we speak. Kingston is flooding out. My neighbor, entire backyard just broke down. We have a lot of landslides right now because it has not stopped raining. So this is causing its own set of challenges as I speak to you. Just to return to community preservation and community building, the Prime Minister, Dr. Ralph Gonsalves, in a national radio broadcast a few days ago, referred to the area in the red zone where most of the residents in Stubbs and the other shelter are staying. This area is north of what is called the Dry River. Dry River is a huge river that I believe in the 1979 volcano, it created this path. And this is referred to as Dry River. And there have been some persons who have been advocating for north of the Dry River, which is, the area that is occupied predominantly by our Kalinagos and Garifuna people, to be designated as a non-inhabitable space. And he objected solidly to this and referred to this area as, quote, the soul of our nation, end of quote, and referenced the rootings of our Kalinagos and Garifuna people there. Well, what happens when the soul of our nation sustains yet again a dreadful and deep injury? Who can tend to the soul better than those who knows and share such soul ties? Our nation's soul needs much tending to right now, and such tending should center on the needs, ideas, input, and spirits of those who carry the soul in their bodies and humanities, our indigenous people. Preservation of communities being expressed in our shelters and by the displaced residents, those who remain, in order to rebuild their lives. Strong sentiments of not wanting to leave their home turfs in Sandy Bay or Owea are expressed, while some are actually saying that they do not mind resettling, and some suggest Stubbs as their new home, and through laughter as they insert the fact that they're being treated so well here in our conversations. But what does this all mean for cultural preservation? One of the things that we know is that historically, when these events have occurred, migration patterns, will follow, where some folks may leave, some will resettle in other parts of the island, elsewhere in the region, or even go overseas. And I mean, this evening we're going to be having a brilliant and beautiful with Dr. Maya Trotz, a professor of civil engineer at the University of South Florida, Dr. Adrian Fraser, a historian here in St. Vincent, who recently wrote about resettlement during previous eruptions and educated us all, and Dr. Kim Palmer, who did her PhD at York University Environmental Studies and actually did a lot of work with the indigenous populations in the region. So, I just want to touch on some of the coping strategies quickly that is being utilized by Vincentians right now as we come to grips with this dreadful and ongoing volcanic eruptions. And the strategies include, those that are expressions of theological beliefs about the phenomena, amplified and expressed in various forms in this current moment. Some are cultural and spiritual too. We have the Rastafarians in the shelter who reference, Jai is doing his work of cleaning the environment, cleaning the land. And these strategies all advance sense making of the disaster and enhance the healing capacity and community building amongst community residents, particularly in the shelter. And we know that historically, within the context of volcanic disasters, strategies have been used and documented. For example, Clarice Barnes' research examined the psychosocial effects of disaster and coping strategies that were used by survivors in the Montserrat eruption in 1995. I mean, Barnes herself, who I had the privilege of meeting because of amazing solidarity and support from scholars, activists in the Caribbean, including Professor Dr. Trotz and her sister Maya Trotz, and the likes of Anna Ford-Smith, Peggy Antrobus, and many, many others who have just been enveloping me in a lot of care and guidance as I put my foot on the ground here in St. Vincent to contribute to my homeland and our communities. So Barnes was a survivor of the disaster, and with her embodied knowledge, she actually studied the effects, of the psychosocial dimensions of these disasters. And she found that God talk, which is these oral expressions of their personal theology or understanding of God, really help to buffer and mitigate the psychosocial effects of disaster. And this God talk is not just, it's gendered also as men, they refer to God as the supreme power, means of redemption, and the women are expressing views of God as their protector and provider, not man. And this coping strategy is present right here in Stubbs. I mean, the same is true for these residents in St. Vincent. Some of them are talking about the power of the Most High. I mean, I have women right now in the shelter who have been hosting prayer meetings. And yesterday I went down with some Bibles because they requested them. And they said that it helps, their cultural beliefs and resilience, Vinci people strong. We are resilient people. For some of our Indigenous residents, they're saying we will never leave. They've organized actually community events at the shelters, and the Indigenous women and men also engage in these God talk, but they also express culturally specific spiritual modes of connecting with their spirit, as they say it, the drumming, and traditional dances, the quadrille dancing, which is a traditional dance has been performed by the Kalinagos and Barfuna residents in the yard of one of the shelter that became a meeting site for storytelling and spontaneous performing. So all this to say that the residents here in the shelters, they have been finding ways to free up themselves from the grip of uncertainty, insecurity, and despair, which is blanketing our island, along with the ash that is still emanating from La Soufrière. Indigenous women cooking food in the kitchen, the conversations about Madongo bakes, which I've never had, made from starch, and fried green bananas, which make my mouth spring water, as we will say here, as you walk to the shelter grounds. These are all things that we're doing here to cope. We are coping to caring. And unfortunately, the last thing that I will say is that we did have positive cases of COVID-19 at our shelter. We had 5 positive hits, and these persons have been isolated. All the residents tested once they got information that, this was a matter that is unfolding. Folks were resistant first to the testing because they had no information. There was no national strategy around how we deal with COVID. I was able to advocate for testing with the local nurse who agreed to come on site and conduct tests. And it was her team that came on Sunday after one of our residents reported not being able to smell or taste anything. And we called them in to do tests. And we got those 5 hits. And everyone, once we talked about caring for each other and supporting each other, did their tests and have agreed to continue to do so consistently every 14 days. We're going to be testing again tomorrow and then testing again in 14 days. And that's it for me. Hello?
Sorry, that's me. No, thank you, Judy. I was just having the problem unmuting myself. I know a lot of people wish they had that button for me in general, but no, I just wanted to really thank you for taking the time out of your day. I know that you've touched, you scratched the surface about what you've been doing on the ground. And I was hoping that you'd be able to drop some links, because I know that, once people heard about the eruption, that there was this flurry of, sites that came up, people donating and people not knowing where to donate to, but wanting to give some money or materials to help out. And I know that you're directly involved with a charitable organization that's based in Stubbs. So that we know you, we trust you, you're our people, that it would be a good place if people are able to, or to pass that information around. If there are others that are looking for that information, if you could drop that into the chat for us, please. And I'll circulate that as well more widely. But just wanted to thank you for that, because St. Vincent, to see what's happening right now, and you had mentioned the rain, and I don't know if people heard there was a call that went through. That was one of my friends in St. Vincent that was just telling me about the rain, Judy. So things are rough in a lot of ways, but I think if you were here for the introduction, we talked about like how out of these moments there's still a way to find the positive ways, and looking to people helping each other is probably the biggest and lesson that we can take away with that, about how we can build a better place. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, hopefully, if I can do that. Okay, where it says stop share, the big red button. So Judy, I don't know if you're able to stay with us for a bit, but if not, we know you have a lot happening. And just seeing the pictures that came out there, the one you couldn't see the picture that I chose for the slide, but I think it's looking from, I think it's Higginson Street in Kingstown, where like by the Anglican church. looking towards the mountain, right? And you can see the explosion and just all the people kind of standing around looking. And what I just had a question, like, what is it like by you in Stubbs? Is the ash there, or has the rain washed it away, or is it hardening it, or what's happening with that?
So Stubbs is pretty clean right now. Stubbs is suffering from mudslides right now. The amount of rain that we got this morning, it has cleared up respect of ash that is here. It's a lot of rain and it is still coming as we speak. So Stubbs is really, really clean. I'm so nervous thinking about those homes that are closest to the red zones that would have mountains of ash still on the roof, because this is the worst nightmare that so much rain would come. And then there are the Lahar flows that, the Prime Minister and the scientists, they were on the radio this morning talking about how dangerous that really is, and then there's severe flooding apparently in Kingstown and other areas across the island because the rain, like I've never seen so much rain here.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to thank you, and for taking the time to join us this afternoon, and wishing you all the best, and we thank you for stepping up to help your community, and it's not an easy thing to do, and we're glad to know you, Judy, and all that you're doing. So on behalf of the program and the community that we have here, we're just sending our support to you, and anything that you need, hopefully we can help out going forward, because like you said before in a message when we talked, it's more of like a marathon, and you're going to build back better once this is all done. So I realize the time we've fallen a bit behind because of some interruptions and starting late, but also having good conversation. So I just wanted to transition into the third panel that we have, which is economic institutions, policy, and underdevelopment in the Caribbean. So that panel is going to be chaired by Professor Melanie Newton, and the three panelists which are going to be taking place or taking part it's going to be David Allens, Janae Knott, and Shanhat Hale. So hopefully we can get everybody set up and jump into that. But if you have any, thank you, Judy, for dropping that into the chat. If people wanted to, or actually that was Professor Trotz putting that in there. If people wanted to check that out later this evening, it's a chance for you to see what's happening in St. Vincent and get some more information from Judy and others. So this is great. So I will, hopefully we have Professor Noon.
Yep, I am here.
Okay, so I will step back and hand it over to you.
So thank you so much. And again, thank you to Judy. That was wonderful. And I just want to say really quickly how amazing it is to be at the Diaspora Voices conference, because it's been a couple of years since the last conference, and to be at a conference where I didn't have to do any work, because previously I was, I guess, the Professor Edmund, or Professor Kevin, as you guys call him. So it's so wonderful, and I really commend you for all of the amazing work you did. This is giving us all life at a very difficult moment, so it's much appreciated. So what I think I will do is just a couple of quick housekeeping things. I just want to suggest that people in the audience just send questions maybe straight to me in the chat if you have them as people are talking. And then as soon as the panelists are finished, I'll just go right into questions from the audience that I have seen. But maybe if you just send them to me, then they're not as distracting for the panelists. So that might be better, and it'll speed things up, because I know we only have an hour. I want to remind the panelists that we do only have an hour, so I will be keeping time gently. I'll give you warnings, like, the 5-minute warning, 3-minute warning, 2-minute warning, and then, stop, so that we can really get to all the questions. And I will introduce each of you before your presentation. So are you good with the order? I have David, Janae, and Shanat. Is that good for you guys? Okay. All right, so I'm just going to introduce each of you, and then we'll take it away. So David Allens, who I have known for many years as a student at U of T, is a fourth-year student at the University of Toronto, having pursued an honors Bachelor's of Arts degree with a double major in political science and criminology. So political science and criminology and socio-legal studies with a minor in Caribbean studies. David's academic interests include the effects of globalization, trade liberalization, and multinational organizations on small island developing states, as well as spatial issues of territorialization in the region. He is an urban leadership research fellow with the School of Cities, where his research focuses on facilitating sustainable urban development in the Caribbean. So, David?
Thanks. So let me just share my screen here. Can everyone see this but not see the presenter view?
I think it's still, yeah, we can see it, but not see the presenter view. Exactly.
Perfect. Okay. So yeah, my name is David. I am from the Bahamas, and I am doing this presentation on mercantilism to the transition from mercantilism to liberalized trade. And it was a part of a paper that I did in New 324 titled "The Myth of Liberalization: Creating Systems that Favor the Global South in Face of Economic Upheaval." So mercantilism has continued to operate in a contemporary environment under the farce of liberalized trade, defined as the process of promoting government regulation of a nation's economy for the purpose of augmenting state power at the expense of rival or often subordinate national powers. Mercantilism was popular in the 16th to 18th century in supporting connections between colonies and their mother countries. This process has been redefined when considering that relationships, when considering the relationship between the Caribbean, US hegemonic power, and supranational organizations of the global North. The global South has argued for decades that free trade has not been a proven method for countries to become rich or regain their wealth. And this is demonstrated in two ways. Globalization and trade liberalization, as defined by the global North, has not led to sustained growth in developing nations. And those that have experienced it, like China and South Korea, for example, did not follow those rules as laid out by the global North, nor were they kind of forced into a box for it in the same way it was done in the Caribbean. And secondly, the wealth that exists in developed nations today was never achieved through free trade. So there are three situation analyses that I will be considering today to highlight this transition to a neo-mercantilism. Haiti, the rice industry and the IMF, Jamaica, the dairy industry and the World Bank, and the Eastern Caribbean, the WTO and its banana industry. These, of course, are arguably more extreme examples of the way rules apply differently in the global North versus the Caribbean. However, it's also evident when considering that in the beginning of the pandemic, the shipment of medical supplies from the Bahamas to the Bahamas, Barbados, and the Cayman Islands was blocked by the US, and the global North has continued to defy global vaccine purchasing guidelines that would have allowed for equitable distribution and have instead secured stockpiles while variants continue to spread throughout the global South. So free trade has always flowed in one direction, from the developing world to the developed world, with anti-protectionist rhetoric and constraints being one of the most prominent things that the third world receives in return. So as mentioned before, this research demonstrates this argument by considering the relationship between the United States and the Caribbean. And this is used not only because of their geographic proximity and long history as trading partners, but because of the role the United States plays in promoting the neoliberal economic policy that dominates multinational organizations, their multilateral agreements, and structural adjustment loans. Similarly, the Caribbean is used as an example because its long history of colonization helps to highlight how the current economic system is merely a revival of age-old mercantilist systems used primarily, if not only, to benefit developed nations. So many Caribbean scholars have posited why the region is so dependent on the exigencies of globalization. One may argue that a consensus on its causes has developed surrounding a combination of the region's size and its history of colonization. When combined, these factors have allowed for persistent underdevelopment. So this history of colonization has socially constructed production distortions and rigidities that are aggravated by the size of the region, creating extreme sensitivity of dependent economies to the vagaries of international trade. This then provides a perfect foundation for neoliberal systems that do not require any recreation of these distortion and rigidities. And so instead, in the mid 1970s, when economic policies which called for more significant cross-border movement of capital, goods, and people expanded significantly as a result of being supported in earnest by the United States, it created what Clive Thomas called a neo-colonial mode of production. Much like the mercantilist ideal of colonialism, countries once again produced what was not consumed at home and consumed what was not produced at home. This allowed relatively seamless implementation of externally articulated production and consumption regimes, especially when presented under the guise of welcoming Caribbean countries into the fold by allowing integration on the global level as equal partners, not highlighting the fact that to do so would cripple domestic industries in favor of international markets by making the region dependent on both metropolitan demand and supply. So the imperialist nature of these production and consumption regimes are demonstrated when considering that the United States has and continues to provide subsidies to its industries and protect them from competition. Yet it bars countries in the Caribbean and the rest of the global South from doing precisely that, to protect their own industries through the use of multinational organizations built to favor the status quo of dependency. From this perspective, free trade has been introduced to diminish the economic growth of the global South and transfer it to the global North. An excellent example of this is the agriculture sector. So agriculture is undoubtedly the most important activity for the majority of the world's poor. Yet, for industrialized nations, it remains the most protected sector, a status that has been staunchly maintained. So the first example of this is in Haiti, where the 1994 agreement between the Haitian government and the International Monetary Fund brought the near total collapse of Haiti's local rice industry. Through the reduction of tariffs on rice imports from 35 to 30%, allowing cheap subsidized rice from the United States to economically undermine Haitian rice farmers who received neither government subsidies nor access to cheap capital. This allowed increased production and economic growth in the United States to supplant the protectionist policies that were already in place in the US. So since 1933, American farmers have always received substantial subsidies. But the 1990s is particularly important because while Haitian farmers were being cornered out of their own market, American farmers received a record number of government subsidies totaling over $20 billion annually by 1991 to 2001. I mean, 1999 to 2001. And from this perspective, there's arguably a connection here to the American executive, considering that this agreement was made during the presidency of Bill Clinton, former governor of Arkansas, a state whose top export is, of course, rice. So next example here, we have the similar example exists in the Jamaican context. As a part of conditions attached to a structural adjustment loan, the World Bank forced Jamaica to reduce import tariffs on milk powder and abolish its subsidies of local dairy, ruining the industry and forcing farmers to dump their production and sell off cows. This is in line with the general trend of developed nations and Western global institutions who forced the global South to stop subsidizing their industries. And in contrast, the global North is allowed to give its citizens access to concessions like the $230 billion subsidies to the US steel industry, or USDA cheese surplus buyback programs, which have continued since 1949, and in 2018 was expanded to liquid dairy. Without protectionist policies, smaller developing nations are unable to compete with inherently artificial competitive advantages created to serve the needs of developed ones. Even when countries in the global south can secure protected trade, multinational corporations and Western governments make a concerted effort to take away these slight benefits. One of the most prominent examples of how competitive advantages are artificially created through state policies is the United States' support of United Fruit and later Chiquita. United Fruit has had a checkered past and maintained a reputation for being ruthless when crossed and acted to remove governments that did not comply with its wishes. This is a company culture that continued after the corporation was dissolved and transitioned into Chiquita. Chiquita has been able to force and keep workers under poor working conditions by suppressing unions and gaining control over shelter, so that if they leave, they stand to lose not only their source of income, but also their house. These actions on the ground have also been coupled by strain placed by the US on its competitors. For example, for decades, Caribbean nations have had access to the European markets for the sale of bananas. Since the 1950s, the UK allowed the protected sale of bananas to replace unprofitable sugar production. And in 1975, this was expanded to Eastern Caribbean countries under the Lomé Convention, allowing African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries to set a price for fixed amounts of a certain commodity, regardless of the world's market price. This provided a way to develop the markets of these foreign European colonies without their reliance on foreign aid. At its peak in the early 1990s, this brought the banana industry to about 20% of the GDP of the Caribbean Windward Islands. This large share of local GDP, however, only represented 7% of Europe's bananas, with 3/4 coming from US multinationals who control the Latin American banana crop. However, petitioning under Section 301 of the US Trade Act, these multinational corporations unleashed the full force of the US's legal and administrative resources against the struggling democracies of 7 small Caribbean countries whose combined wealth at the time was less than 0.4% of that of the US. This despite the fact that the US itself does not export bananas. Warning against this action, its own State Department argued that an ill-advised attack on the banana industry and the decline of a traditional one-crop economy would only increase the lure of drug money. A position that has been proven right, with one farmer in the Windward Islands stating, "We have no other choice but to rely on marijuana." This brought an end to what was once known as green gold in the region and affected the livelihood of thousands in the region, including our keynote speaker today, Gabriel Aladua.
All right, David, I just need to let you know that it's if you can wrap up quickly.
Yeah, sure, for sure. Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, no worries.
Sorry.
So this system of free trade favors developed nations because of their economic dominance and because it continued exploitation of uneven and international conditions, while allowing these costs to be borne by poor countries through the application of nominal sovereignty. Without freer regulations, small island nations will continue to be restricted in the creation of effective safety net policies that both protect critical industries and prepare citizens for industry transitions as local and international labor markets change. And correcting this negative domestic impact of globalization requires countries to express their democratic legitimacy, even when viewed as wrong by international institutions. This is especially true now as countries in the region attempt to develop new avenues for economic growth that are not so susceptible to external shock. So for the global north, domestic protectionism through subsidies has long been proven necessary in core industries to support increased competitiveness, economic growth, and stability, a sentiment that should be expanded to the global south. This then can allow globalization to continue promoting trade for specialists and niche markets that countries would now have more capital and capacity to develop. And without the basic level of protectionism, when economies of scale yield production changes like outsourcing and mechanization, The associated job losses lead to higher rates of income inequality due to the highly integrated nature of the country's economy. So in the aftermath of the pandemic, a more concerted effort needs to be made in the region to create, and in many instances recreate, systems that facilitate food sovereignty and security at the national and regional level to meet the region's basic needs. In the same vein, countries need to reconsider their reliance on industries like tourism that are extremely sensitive to external economic shock. And in the long term, these countries need to wane their economies from the sway of global markets by developing industries that purely serve local and regional needs instead of externally dependent ones. While the ideals of free trade are correct, so the countries need cross-border trade to maximize their outputs and expand industries, it should now truly be done, seeing countries as equal partners in agreements and acknowledging the systemic barriers the third world faces. Or perhaps better yet, with developing nations being the primary beneficiaries just once. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay. All right. So just a reminder to folks, please send questions and we'll come to them afterwards in the Q&A. So I'm going to move on to our next speaker. Thank you so much, David. So Janae Knott, your intrepid conference organizer, is a fourth year student in Rotman Commerce, pursuing minors in economics and Caribbean studies. Her academic journey.
We need to.
Sorry.
No worries. No worries. Her academic journey in Rotman has allowed her to gain a good understanding of finance and strategy, and this proved helpful as she completed internships at TD Bank and McKinsey & Company. Similarly, her journey in Caribbean studies provided her with a unique lens regarding economic development and techniques of modern capitalism as it relates to race. She's currently the assistant conference organizer of the Caribbean Studies program.
Thank
So
you, Professor Newman.
just so you know, I will be sending little notes in the chat just to let you know about time. So
Okay, sounds good. Let me just share my screen. Hold on, I think it just froze. Uh-oh. Now.
are you having a technical problem?
Yeah, like it's just frozen on my end.
Okay.
Okay, wait, let me try it again. Okay,
There you go.
Yep. So,
all right. I was like, this better work. Okay, so I know I only have like 10 minutes, so if you hear me talking a little bit fast, you know why. Okay, so what I will be discussing today is the US embargo. Well, the embargo that the United States imposed on Cuba, and just some of the consequences that it's had on Cuba's economic development. I thought this would be really interesting to study because I found that in the literature, many people had kind of studied the effects of the embargo in specific sectors, for example, like medical or healthcare, but they hadn't really studied what were some of the broader effects to the actual economy and how these repercussions trickle down throughout time. So essentially, this embargo, which started in 1961, really isolated Cuba from economic activity that was taking place in the Western Hemisphere. And then this had multiple different consequences, including restricting their ability for industrialization, the ability to obtain cash inflow through foreign investment, and then strains on business financing, which came from international banking constraints. So since the embargo lasted around continuously for like a 40-year period, there are a lot of different effects that I could cover, but I will just focus on a couple. So in terms of what I will be talking about, I'm first going to start off discussing the state of the Cuban economy prior to the embargo. So just looking at development during the revolution, and then related to the government's development agenda, and then the relationship with the Soviet Union. And then I'm going to discuss the logistics of the embargo and its effect on trade, so with exports and imports. And I will also talk about the respective consequences for certain target industries. And then lastly, I'll discuss the embargo's effect on Cuba's financial system. So just the nature of transaction costs that emerged as a result of the policies, such as the struggle to obtain foreign investment and then increasing financing costs for Cuban companies who are trying to do business abroad. Okay, so in terms of the Cuban economy before and after the Cuban Revolution, before 1959, the United States of America was Cuba's main trading partner. So they accounted for about 70% of the country's trade flow. So thinking about the exports and imports collectively. Usually in terms of trade flow, the economists, they like to like capture trade flow as a result of different functions. So usually it would be considering the distance of the countries and then also on the market sizes of the respective countries involved. So it kind of makes sense as to why the US was one of the main trading partners. So then in the early 1960s, Cuba pivoted so that it was mostly trading with the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. So this refers to the bloc of socialist countries in Eastern Europe that are opposing Western capitalist practices. This makes sense because obviously in the revolution, Cuba kind of transitioned to being a socialist state. So the Socialist Bloc formed the Community for Mutual Economic Assistance. And then this was looking at the country's it was an organization which is focused on the economic development of countries in Eastern Europe. So it conducted most of its trade with countries of this socialist bloc from early 1960 to early 1990. And this is about 85% of its trade, and they traded goods like oil, grain, fertilizer, animal feed, and raw materials. So Cuba's transition to socialism also resulted in worsening relationships with the United States and the US government. So Castro's government began to take steps to increase the independence of the Cuban economy and then strengthen it substantially so that it could stand on its own terms. So to do this, he tried to implement a national development strategy, and this had a long-term component and a short-term component. So the long-term component included investing in industries of promise, so including biotechnology, pharmaceuticals, and then medical technology. And then in the short term, the government actually took quite drastic measures of economic reform. This included nationalizing the previously foreign-owned industries, the creation of a central planning board, and then the government taking ownership of a lot of the businesses. So this effectively kind of prohibited private commerce in the country. So the Cuban government at this point became the main employer of the country, and they started to regulate wages. Another objective of the government at this time was to decrease reliance on sugar exports, but we see that this isn't what actually happened in practice. So in 1963, the government was pretty much back to focusing on increasing the sugar exports because they thought that it might open doors for growth in other like export areas. Then by 1964, so by 1964, the Cuba and the USSR, they reach an agreement where the USSR commits to paying above market prices for sugar in for a couple of years. So this is kind of what we would call like a forward contract in finance. So despite the actual market spot rate for sugar, Cuba would be obtaining a price higher than the market rate. This is beneficial in the short run. However, like the government basically was implementing the prospective sugar plan. So this is implemented from like 1965 to 1970 that made really ambitious targets for the amount of sugar that they wanted to export. So as you can see, the reliance on sugar actually increased, and then businesses, because they all became owned by the government, weren't actually competing against one another. So because the businesses weren't really motivated by competition, we didn't get that natural productivity increase that comes in the free market. So I'm basically mentioning these different factors because economists a lot of the time kind of have a difficult time trying to isolate what were the effects of the embargo and then what were the effects of the Cuban Revolution and the changes that were coming about at this time. So it kind of complicates the matters, but like it's still pretty interesting. Okay, in terms of the logistics of the embargo, it began under President Eisenhower's rule. So he enacted the sanctions in 1961 through the Trading with the Enemy Act. And this act basically permitted the president to impose economic sanctions towards another country if the country was experiencing war or hostile conditions or a national emergency. And then the US Congress passed the Foreign Assistance Act in 1961, which basically said the US would not be providing aid to communist countries. So we can kind of see here, it seems like the United States was opposed ideologically to the communist system and socialist values. In 1962, President Kennedy said importing goods of Cuban origin or goods through Cuba would be banned. And then the Treasury Division was responsible for implementing this actual policy. And then it seemed as though the US presidents would all be able to use their own discretion with regards to implementing the embargo going forward. But then two different regulations were passed in the 1990s, which effectively like made the embargo more rigid. So this included the Cuba Democracy Act and the Liberated Act. And then in the year 2000, Congress passed two policies which actually decreased the restrictions of the embargo. So this is the Trade Sanctions Reform and then the Export Enhancement Act. So these regulations outlined exemptions for the sanctions in place, specifically for certain companies to sell agricultural products and medical supplies to Cuban consumers. Now I'll just get a little bit into talking about the effects on Cuban exports, starting with the nickel industry. So Cuba greatly suffered from the restrictions on exports because it lost the opportunity to export nickel to a lot of different countries. So Cuba is endowed with the world's fourth largest reserve of nickel, and it's an important good, it's an important material in household products, for example, stainless steel. So this also poses to be like a really unique opportunity for foreign countries to invest in the Cuban nickel production process. To invest in the nickel production process. And the sanctions imposed consequences on foreign companies who had already involved themselves in the country's nickel production process in any form. For example, Share International, it's a Canadian resource company, so they do a lot of mining for nickel and cobalt. But due to the fact that Share International was involved in nickel mining operations in Cuba, the executives of the company were punished and they were denied US visas when they applied. Let me just see if okay. Shugi said, okay, thank you, Professor Newton. I see your message, okay. So yeah, the Helms-Burton law basically said that any product would had components of Cuban origin, including Cuban nickel, would not be able to be imported into the US. So what we can see from all of this is that there's really high distribution costs, even for Cuban nickel. So despite the fact that they're well endowed with the resource, they were pretty much very limited in how they could actually make it profitable for themselves. Whoops. Sorry, I think it's okay. Yeah, so in terms of, in the sanctions, one second. Yeah, so the Cuban Democracy Act of 1992 and the Torricelli Law basically made the sanctions increasingly extraterritorial. So they applied to other different countries and companies in other countries that were outside of the US. A foreign subsidiary basically is when the parent company, in this case, it would be the US, they have a controlling interest in a company that is not in the US. So they own a significant portion of their equity. So specifically, the Cuban Democracy Act prohibited America's foreign subsidiaries from trading with Cuba, even if they functioned independently. And then if you were a subsidiary who violated the regulations, you would face the same legal consequences as US companies who violated the law. So just to give you some examples about how Cuban sectors were impacted by US ownership, I put some logos on the screen here to kind of illustrate, but Bayer is a German multinational company, and they were Cuba's longstanding pesticide supplier until they set up production facilities in Kansas City to manufacture one of its products. So then they sought government permission by the US to be able to send their products to Cuba, and then Bayer was denied. And so then to avoid further difficulty, they stopped supplying Cuba with agricultural products altogether. It's a pretty similar case for Sanachem, or Sanachem. They're a South African company. They used to be supplying Cuba with, I think, pesticides or another type of agrochemical. And then it became a US company because the US company Dow actually increased their ownership in Sanachem, and then they stopped supplying the country with products as well. And then it's a similar case for Wallace and Tiernan. They're a U.S. company who like supply components that would be used in Cuba's water filtration system. And then Pharmacia and Upjohn and Siemens are two related cases. I don't really have time to talk about them, but they actually show that the extraterritoriality had a really significant effect on the medical supply industry. Okay, so the last thing that I just want to briefly talk about is the strain on Cuba's financial system. So basically, the entire situation made foreign investment pretty inaccessible. So even when foreign investment was increasing for the entire region of the Caribbean, Cuba wasn't really able to benefit from this. And if you do any kind of cross-country comparisons for a single year, you see like very large disparities. So for example, in 2011, the Dominican Republic received an inflow of foreign investment, which was like 2.4 billion, and Cuba only received 110 million. So pretty large differences. And then just lastly, banking with foreign financial institutions was really hard because Cuba was prohibited from doing any business in the US dollar. So if a bank violated these restrictions, and they faced very large and very public consequences. I just put some examples here up on the screen, but banks ended up being blacklisted, and therefore like it deterred them from doing business completely. And then other firms who actually were willing to do business with Cuba, they would impose really high interest rates as a result. So to compensate for the Cuban risk, Cuban businesses ended up having to pay really high interest and financing rates, even for loans. So yeah, that's pretty much my presentation. And I guess this just gives you a much better idea about the situation and some of the effects it's had up till now.
Thank you so much. That was really like a very sophisticated analysis. I think I love the fact that you were really trying to separate out the specific impacts of the embargo. I think that's really important work. Thank you. Okay, and now we have our last speaker, Shanat Haile. Hi, Shanat. Who is graduating this June, congratulations, with a double major in history and political science and a minor in African studies. Her academic interests include history and politics of the Horn of Africa, anti or alternative development theory, and more recently, intellectual histories of Caribbean decolonization and transnational Black radical feminism. Outside of school, she organizes alongside her peers to produce 1919 magazine, an independent, multidisciplinary critical publication led by Black youth designed for Canada's racialized communities. I've taught you for several years, and this is the first time I've heard about that, so I would love to know more. Okay, thank you.
Yes, I would love to tell you guys more if we have some time later on. I believe Aneta is going to put up my slides, and I hope you guys can hear me okay.
Turn up your volume a little bit. Is that possible, or is it?
I think it might just be distance from my computer. Is that better?
A little bit better, yeah.
Sorry about that.
I hear you, it's okay.
So, like earlier, I'm gonna probably try to speak a little bit quickly as well, because I don't want to be cut off whatsoever. So in accordance with the theme of this event, we all understand that the effects of COVID-19 on the Caribbean are very much relevant at the moment. And I would like to dedicate the next few minutes of your time to call attention to the state of the pandemic in Haiti, particularly highlighting the ongoing media discourse on the matter and the underlying issues that the virus is and may continue to exacerbate in the country. At the onset of the pandemic, the majority of early media reports were primarily focused on Haiti's inability to deal with a pandemic of this magnitude and the limitations of the Haitian state in responding to public health crises in general. Researchers and journalists often will recall the devastating effects of the 2010 earthquake or the nearly decade-long cholera epidemic as recent examples of Haiti's inherent susceptibility to natural disaster and its overall position as a failed state. And if we move into the next slide, you can see some of the articles that are being published at the moment that reflect this. So in May of last year, the Miami Herald reported COVID could lead to social unrest and even famine in Haiti, describing the threat of the virus as a perfect storm approaching. And as early as April 2020, publications were being written warning for the impending devastation in Haiti, citing the government's so-called systematic reduction of the national health budget as a source of concern, and essentially making the claim that the country is prone to disasters and that its inability to deal with issues of public health are a fault of its weak government. However, these types of narratives regarding Haiti's ineptitude or susceptibility to failure can be traced back decades, even centuries, into the aftermath of the revolution itself. So the aim of this presentation and my ongoing research paper that I'm currently writing is to draw attention to and critique this prevailing discourse of an inherently doomed Haiti and the ways in which they reproduce a particular narrative about the broken or failed condition of the Haitian state and its people. What deserves increased attention at this time, however, are the ongoing external factors that continue to ensure Haiti remains in this position, not an inherent susceptibility to adversity, but structurally unable to respond to disaster and therefore in perpetual need of foreign assistance. The pervasive narrative of a hopeless Haiti is often taken up and spread by the media at the expense of highlighting yet again the actual causes of Haitian public health limitations, which are primarily rooted in the effects of foreign intervention and the deliberate attempts to destabilize any type of real progress at the state and the grassroots level. In the case of COVID-19, not only are historical factors relevant, but the ongoing political crisis that has sparked mass uprisings for the last few years must also be a topic of focus in this discussion. So to begin with, we must highlight the legitimate concerns that the spread of the novel coronavirus poses to Haiti, and that will be listed, a few of them in the next slide. So Haiti's classification as the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere means that it is generally discussed in media and popular discourse for matters relating to its poverty, food insecurity, inadequate healthcare resources, lack of infrastructure and clean water, low literacy rates, densely populated shanty towns, isolated rural communities, and of course, political instability. As of 2020, the country has only 900 healthcare institutions for its population of over 11 million. And most of these populated near and around the capital city. These conditions make quarantine, isolation, and social distancing nearly impossible in most cases, and a stay-at-home order cannot be properly enforced. Another cause for concern being the possible spread of the virus occurring due to regular movement at the border with the Dominican Republic, where thousands of Haitians cross every day to conduct business at border markets. So it's understandable that there should exist genuine concern for a virus that the country is simply unprepared to deal with. When the first case of COVID-19 was confirmed in Haiti on March 19th of last year, alarms were raised. The government immediately stopped all commercial flights into Haiti, banned public gatherings, closed factories and schools, and introduced a mask mandate. According to the previously referenced May 2020 article by the Miami Herald, health experts projected the number of infected Haitians to reach 430,000, and a rising death toll of over 20,000 due to factors like high contact spread, a lack of readily available medical supplies and PPE, and an insufficient number of healthcare providers on the island. Projections like these inspired a number of publications to continue highlighting the impending catastrophic damage that this virus was certain to cause. An immediate plan of action is urgently needed, stated an April 2020 report published by the Journal of Community Health. Another report emphasized, at a time when all countries are concerned about the COVID-19 pandemic, Haiti will not be able to benefit from the international solidarity that could have helped it to cope, as it did with the earthquake of January 2010. In the meantime, international mobilization is needed to limit the consequences of this pandemic in Haiti. So, upon reading this and doing this research, I found myself a little bit confused because not unlike any other country in the world, every living person is understood to be at somewhat of a risk for a highly transmittable respiratory virus like COVID-19. We have seen the way in which some of the most developed countries, even our own, have struggled to handle a global health crisis of this magnitude. So I was particularly interested by how the immediate response to an impending crisis in Haiti is then followed by almost a direct call to action for the mobilization of the international community. It's almost like signaling to NGOs to gear up. If we understand NGOs to be in kind of a business of poverty, but kind of stating business is coming. However, most of the reports of this nature appear to come to a halt as time passed, and it became a little bit more apparent that the immediate catastrophic spread of this virus that had been anticipated was in fact not actually really happening. And you can see this in the next slide. It's kind of scattered, I apologize, but I just wanted to show you how abundant these types of headlines are right now that are being published. This type of like confusion circulating on the mystery of low rates of COVID deaths in Haiti. And like this question of like, how on earth could a country characterized by so-called chronic poverty be experiencing an incredibly low death toll, especially in comparison to neighboring Dominican Republic that is recording infections at a number 16 times higher than that of Haiti. So of course, most of the uncertainty regarding the state of the pandemic in Haiti is largely due to the unavailability of mass and wide-scale testing, meaning that thousands of cases may have gone undiagnosed, untreated, and unrecorded. The fact that 50% of Haitian population is under the age of 23, with only 4.5% over the age of 65 may also be a major contributing factor to these low numbers. Nevertheless, casual reference is being made to these factors, and instead, most of the reporting focus has been on how and why Haiti appears to have been spared from the worst of this virus. One article published by the Tampa Bay Times last December opens, "In Haiti, they are acting like COVID doesn't exist. What's going on? Nobody's quite sure." And you can go to the next slide and kind of want to the rest of this presentation, I kind of want to focus on what the responses to this type of data is and how they appear to be perpetuating the age-old narrative about disaster, catastrophe, and failure in Haiti. So one of the most personally upsetting findings in my research was a recent article published by the American Psychological Association, and the paper is titled "What the World Could Learn from Haitian Resilience While Managing COVID-19." So it discusses the psychological impact of the pandemic on our daily lives, particularly in the North American context. And the authors pose the question, could Haitians be mentally better prepared to cope with the COVID-19 mental and social distancing outcomes? The majority of Haitians continue to engage in their daily routines as if they were desensitized to the effects of disasters. So because of Haiti and its history, they argue that, quote, previous traumatic exposures may have served as a buffer against the debilitating effects of the COVID-19 pandemic among Haitians. Additionally, it states, Haitians' ability to create and make art from their suffering is their trademark, and that Haitians have naturally adopted a practical posture to cope with the pandemic. Countries that are severely affected by the COVID-19 could learn from the Haitian way of dealing with large-scale disasters. Another article suggests that Haitians and their apparent contempt for the pandemic protocols recommended by the government stems from the widely held superstitious beliefs that, quote, the virus is the result of sin and it is God's punishment on humans for sinful ways. I don't know about you, but I find these papers really appalling, but they're not unique. And it's apparent that the current reality of the virus challenges the general consensus about what disaster and crisis should look like in Haiti. In the aftermath of the earthquake, American and other foreign news outlets on the ground had been reporting to viewers about the way in which Haitians roaming the streets amidst the destruction appeared to be simply indifferent, almost non-responsive and expressionless to the traumatic event that they had just experienced. Why don't Haitians cry? They openly asked. We can move to the next slide. So in her 2015 text titled, "Why Haiti Needs New Narratives," Haitian-born anthropologist Gina Athena Ulysses recounts the origins of this narrative. The narrative that positions Haitians simply as subjects of research, both subhuman or superhuman, subhumanity stemming from their view as Haitians as inherently irrational, devil-worshipping, resistant, and uneducated, and superhuman stemming from their incredible and enduring resistance. So I'm echoing the sentiment in the book here, and that is we must be less interested in correcting these representations, but rather focused on interrogating them, revealing the kind of work that they do in reproducing both the myth of Haiti and the actual conditions on the ground. Not only does this narrative completely dehumanize Haitians, but it willfully neglects the historical circumstances that have put the country into conditions of so-called chronic poverty to begin with. So let me take a step back and say that I'm not arguing for the end of preventative health measures in Haiti or any vulnerable nation for that matter. Rather, the underlying problem of concern here is the pervasive narrative of a socially inept and doomed Haiti, forever exposed and openly susceptible to environmental threats and natural disasters. The idea that they will be hit hardest and worst because they will always be terminally incapable of responding to health crises, and especially not without the support of US aid and NGO assistance. This is a notion that we must critique and continuously challenge. And as Professor Kevin Edmonds puts it in one of his papers, poverty and desperation facing Haiti and so many other nations is not natural. It is a social construction. Rather than subscribing to neoliberal approaches to dealing with the crisis in Haiti, where over 10,000 NGOs already operate in the most privatized social sector in the Americas, narratives about healthcare disparity must be historically informed. If we are speaking only of recent events, we must consider and recall the 2004 American-led ousting of President Aristide, whose populist platform was making efforts to establish essential services and healthcare with the assistance of Cuba and scale back the level of privatization in the country. Sorry, if you could also move to the next slide. And we must consider the way in which the international response to the earthquake has further entrenched the notion of Haiti as a so-called republic of NGOs, who are unaccountable to the Haitian people and profit off of their suffering. We must consider how UN peacekeepers were actually the ones responsible for bringing cholera into Haiti to begin with, or how the building of the biggest hospital in Port-au-Prince has yet to finish completion, almost 10 years after it was promised by foreign donors. We must consider how in the last year, the United States has removed their temporary protected status of Haitians after the earthquake and continues the deportation of COVID-positive Haitians, further putting the country at risk for a spread of the virus. And finally, we must consider how the recent uprisings in Haiti, protesting the corruption and illegitimacy of the Moïse government that remains non-transparent and backed by international political elites, has worsened the material conditions of Haitians even before the onset of the pandemic. So just to wrap up, fear about an impending catastrophic virus should not be directed towards Haitians' inability to oblige or comply with social distancing mandates, but concern should be for the Haitian people continuously subject to foreign intervention in a deliberately weakened healthcare system. Despite ongoing decade-long promises from the international community to support the Haitian people's right to self-determination and rebuilding their own infrastructures, it is these same very actors that are perpetuating the narrative of state failure in Haiti. The Haitian people know what they want. They have never been afraid to voice their opposition to foreign intervention, and they are now explicitly calling for the US to get out of Haiti. Decision-making about Haiti's healthcare system should not be left to the hands of international financial institutions or donor-backed NGOs. Haiti has been a radical state from its inception, and therefore solutions to this problem must be radically oriented as well. And I'll just go to the final slide, and I will end with this offering from Robin D.G. Kelly, and he states, "Of course, it is easy to see how the devastation left by the earthquake would reinforce the image of Haiti as victim. But representations are not objective truths, but choices, framed and edited by ideology." And yeah, thank you. This is an ongoing paper, so I'm open to all types of critiques and suggestions and comments. I'm so sorry, I did not see your time warning. I had my screen covered. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. Yeah, I don't know. I think Zoom is not the ideal means of sort of sending those little slips of paper that we would normally have done in person. But thank you so much. They were all really amazing presentations, and we do have a few questions. So I can't see David on the screen, but that's okay, because the first question is actually a two-part question kind of for Janae. And thanks again to all of you for outstanding presentations. So Janae, how does the example of Cuba or the broader study of the history of the Caribbean either sort of confirm or complicate some of the more orthodox economic theories that are taught? And I know that was a question someone posed to Janae, but I guess all three of you, if any of you wants to weigh in on that, go for it. Do you need me to repeat it again?
I think I mostly understand. Wait, just repeat it one more time in case.
Oh, no worries. So how does the example of Cuba, well, how does the example of Cuba or the broader study of the history of the Caribbean either confirm or complicate some of the more orthodox economic theories that we are taught?
I think that's a really interesting question. So, like in the broader case of the Caribbean, I think it really has served as I think I was actually in Professor Newton's course when it was a textbook or was a reading that was basically saying that the Caribbean was kind of like a laboratory for the techniques of like modern capitalism. So that understanding has basically spread throughout, I guess, the world, and just understanding labor as being our primary like commodity, and then humans essentially, once you take away their humanity in terms of like chattel slavery, people just become resources that can be manipulated and mobilized in ways that can make things profitable. So we see that very broadly in the Caribbean, and then that model has basically been tweaked and taken to other places. The foundation of that hasn't changed that much. In terms of actual, let's say, confirmations of economic theory, there's like a thesis called the Staples thesis, and it's basically saying that economic growth in a country can come from like forward linkages and then backward linkages, where forward linkages, I'm pretty sure it's like when a country like creates inputs, and then they actually also create goods that use those inputs. Backward linkages is like the opposite. So like the country actually has like the infrastructure and the other resources to create like certain inputs that can be used. So it basically says that like those are the sources of economic growth, and it's conducive to having good economic activity. In the cases of like what we are talking about in terms of Cuba, we can see that the endowment of natural resources is not actually enough for them to have like sufficient economic activity. You have to actually have like customers who are going to use, for example, nickel as the components for nickel to be an industry that's like profitable and that actually can return income to its citizens. So I think it like really, it kind of comes full circle in terms of like proving economic theory. And was there another part of the question, or? Oh wait, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, no, you're answering the question. This is because yeah, the second part of the question that you're answering now is about sort of confirming or complicating sort of orthodox economic theory. So you're totally answering it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and then I think of even just like theories of kind of like factor, proportion, and intensity. So those are basically theories that are saying like you have comparative advantage in producing certain goods when you have like the right proportions of like labor versus capital, and then capital being like types of equipment and other like machinery that you can use. So in the case of Cuba, I think it actually disproves this theory in some ways, because certain industries which they in theory should be good at producing or producing goods for, they haven't necessarily succeeded at because of the actual embargo. So an example of this would say be like software development. It was theorized that that could be an industry of like really substantial growth for Cuba, specifically because in terms of factor proportions, you don't necessarily have like a lot of fixed costs or like capital expenditure you need like to be good at software development, but you do need a lot of like intellectual capability and training, where Cuba succeeds in that area. However, due to the fact that they haven't been able to access like a lot of the hardware, so thinking about computers from like Apple or Hewlett Packard, they can't access those goods to go to the university, for example, the University of Havana. So it actually like makes things harder. And then even for like smaller components of computers, they were to buy it from other places, they would have goods, for example, like microprocessors from Toshiba. And this would mean that they were effectively cut off from accessing these goods as well. It's hard for them to have like Adobe, like other, I guess, software that they would regularly use in these areas. So essentially, that I think it disproves it in just like thinking about factor intensity, like as an area of success. But yeah.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else want to, like, it's pretty amazing to hear you talk about economics. That's really impressive. Does anyone else want to weigh in on this, or do you want to?
I think if we're talking about in general, just about like changing traditional understandings of certain things about Caribbean, I guess in the Haitian sense, what I wanted to focus on was our traditional understanding of the roots of poverty and what development actually looks like and what it should look like. Especially being a political science student, it's very hard to go through classes on development from a particular orientation, a capitalist orientation that I don't necessarily subscribe to, and having to like personally seek out other theories or other like knowledge systems and knowledge production that like kind of switches our understanding of what poverty looks like. And Professor Kevin Edmonds, he put it in like so well in our class about the Haitian Revolution that like if you want to understand how imperialism works, if you want to understand how what poverty looks like, and how the international liberal world order looks like today, we have to study Haiti. And I think that that's the perfect example for me to look like to investigate when we're talking about shifting narratives or shifting traditional understandings of certain disciplines. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. David, did you want to?
Yeah, sure. I think the Cuban example is also just really helpful because it's a good model for the way that nations are able to stay resilient against external pressure, even in very extreme cases. So I think it's helpful for when reframing how the region will develop in the future, how we can become more internally dependent on each other. Through things like software development. Again, yeah, I saw in the chat. Yeah, that's not something that I really would have thought of when thinking of the impacts of like the embargo on the environment in Cuba. So I think that's really helpful. And again, same thing with Haiti, in seeing the way that these same external systems can impact and create these systems of poverty. It's important in figuring out how to combat that in the future.
Thanks to all of you. So we still have a couple minutes. I'm going to ask another question that came in while you were all speaking. So given the problems that the Caribbean has with agriculture and trade policies, what would you give in terms of advice? Give up on agriculture? Try to work with an alternative? What might those alternatives look like? And I think thinking about Shanat's insights about the sort of industry of NGOs and their unaccountability, I think, thinking about that also in terms of, these questions of agriculture, trade policies, but also some of these development policies as well. So whoever wants to go have a first stab at that, go for it.
I think I can kind of go first stab. I think it's really important for us to be in the driver's seat of when and where you want to accept that type of external developmental loans and NGO support, because without those structures in place, they just kind of do whatever they want, and they are just adhering to their own goals, which in some instances are contradictory to the aims of regional development. So I mean, I don't think, for instance, in the question of abandoning agriculture and its relationship with trade, I don't think that it's something that should be abandoned, because those are important things for us to develop in terms of self-sufficiency and food sovereignty. But I think it's more important that it's framed from a understanding of these things should be produced to help Caribbean people around the region to balance out things that we have and don't have from a broader regional perspective, before then taking the step and saying, okay, what can't we produce? What are we not able to produce and need to import, instead of just saying these are the things we need. Let's go out and get it.
I think I can add on. to that, just from a different perspective. I don't think that the countries of the Caribbean should be abandoning agriculture necessarily, especially because like it's just necessary for the subsistence of like their local populations. What I do think though is that they should, if possible and given the funding, invest in ensuring that agriculture is like as productive as it can be. So in terms of with the chemicals that they're using and the technology and also the techniques that they're applying so that the maximum yield can be produced. And then I also think that if people were to do some research and like, this is just in terms of exports, there could be some like forecasting regarding like the market prices of different agricultural products in the future. For example, if there's expected increase in demand for bananas within like a 10-year span, then you already know the market price for bananas would be pretty high in the future. So making sure that you have the infrastructure to farm a lot of bananas would be good in the short run, and it would have some pretty good long run benefits. So that's what I would suggest.
Sorry, just a little warning, my computer's doing something. So if I cut out, I apologize. I took pictures of the questions so I could ask them. So this is a question for Janae. Can you expand on the work of Sherritt International in the nickel mining industry in Cuba? The intervention of Canadian mining companies in the Caribbean has increased substantially over the past 2 decades. Barrick Gold, for example, is extracting gold in the Dominican Republic with serious repercussions for the environment and people. And that's a question from Nestor Rodriguez.
Hi, Professor Rodriguez. I hope you're doing well. In terms of mining, especially for Sherritt International, so they are a Canadian company, and then they mine like 2 goods primarily. So this is like nickel and then cobalt. And then the nickel operations, they're in Moa, Cuba, or is it Mo or Moa? But basically the arrangement they have is like a 50-50 joint venture. So they basically make 50% of the decisions and 50% of the profit. And then the other 50%, let me get the exact name. It's with General Nickel Company SA. So that's like a Cuban company, or it's a mineral producer based in Cuba. So essentially, I think that the way that especially it works with this kind of arrangement is that the company, like the foreign company, has a lot of advantages because in partnering with the Cuban company, they can override some of the regulations that they would have had initially if they were just like, I guess, a foreigner intruding. But also they have competitive advantages in the fact that they are with somebody or with a company that is very understanding of the landscape, as well as like has access to mining infrastructure there. So I'm not actually too sure who owns the production facilities, but these kinds of ventures, I think, at least in my opinion, have the potential to be potentially like exploitative. Just because like the actual citizens and the people from Cuba and probably even the people from that city are not actually like profiting off of the nickel. It's probably money going abroad. So I think that these arrangements probably just have to be reconsidered in terms of profit sharing, decision making, and even who actually owns the facilities. So like for that company, they're vertically integrated, meaning that they would own not only like the distribution facilities, but they would also probably have like the so the level before it in terms of production, and like they would have like the drills and the stuff doing the actual mining. So I think the Cuban companies should have more access like in terms of the integration process, so that the closer they get to having end-to-end control over the supply chain, the better off they're going to be. In terms of pollution, I'm not actually sure. I tried to look into it a bit, but I'm not really seeing anything specific in terms of the effects on the environment, although I can assume they're pretty serious. So yeah.
So I'm looking at the time, and there were a couple other questions, but I do know, there's another panel after this. But I just want to say, having taught all 3 of you, it was so amazing to hear the incredible things you're doing with this knowledge. It's really my privilege. So thank you on behalf of everyone in the audience for this discussion and all of this really profound food for thought. And, I have to say, as an early modern historian, we got to talk about mercantilism. It is actually a far more complicated and far scarier theory of the world than you might even realize. So, but that's a conversation we can have another time. But yeah, it's not well enough understood in the modern world, I think. So it's very important that you're trying to think it through that way. Okay, so thank you so much. And I guess my work as panel chair is done, and I will pass things back to Kevin.
Okay, so as I have said many, many times through the course of the day, thank you all for bearing with us and for being patient in terms of the slight delays that we have in terms of the schedule. I know you've all been very understanding, and thank you for staying with us. And I just wanted to say hi to, there's someone who has been here from prior to 10 o'clock this morning, Professor Judy Howman. Thank you for staying with us. I see you with the nice angle on the camera there, if you can hear me. How are you? Yeah, so she was my mentor in undergrad at York, the person that tricked me into going to grad school. So shame on you. No, but thank you for you're a great person. I know Professor Trotz also knows you well. You have a long lineage within the program here. So I just wanted to say hi to you before we transition into the keynote address. So with that, I wanted to just switch gears, and thanks to Gabriel and Chris for being patient while we were wrapping up the final panel. So I'm incredibly happy to be able to introduce two very, very prolific, important, tireless advocates and comrades in terms of fighting for the rights of migrant workers and workers overall within the crisis in particular, but more generally. So I just wanted to introduce two people. So we have our keynote right now, where we have Gabriel Aladua, who is originally from St. Lucia. Hopefully we can pull them up. And I have a delay on my screen, so that's my apologies if I'm being somewhat disjointed. And we have Chris there jumping on. So Gabriel, I realized that through talking that our families live probably like no more than 10 minutes apart from each other in the Mabia Valley, right? So I'm Rich Fon. I think you said you're Denry Riviere. So yeah, the Mabia Valley is representing strong. We had Chevy, who was here, and we had Donna, who was here for a moment. So we had the St. Lucian contingent come out pretty strong for the conference. But it's an honor to introduce Gabriel, who was previously a migrant farmer, and he's now an organizer with the collective Justicia for Migrant Workers. He's been directly involved in numerous campaigns to improve the conditions of migrant workers, most recently speaking about how farms are incredibly dangerous sites of COVID-19 transmission and what must be done in order to ensure safe living and working conditions. So our second speaker, which makes me really happy that when we were organizing this conference, we had such a strong pool of people within Caribbean studies to look at, and we didn't have to go very far because we have Chris Ramsaroop, who is an instructor. He teaches New 315, which is Caribbean Foodways. So he's been with the program for several years, and he's an organizer with Justicia for Migrant Workers. He's also, as I said, an instructor here in the program and a clinical instructor at the University of Windsor's Faculty of Law. Chris is working to currently complete his PhD at OISE, and he has been organizing as a grassroots activist with Justicia for Migrant Workers for nearly 20 years. So I just wanted to give a big thank you to both of you for being so patient, but also for accepting our, the opportunity to be able to come and give the keynote address. So just before handing things over to you, I wanted to just draw attention to a petition that Justicia for Migrant Workers has put together, and I'll just drop it in the chat, and if Chris or Gabriel, you wanted to speak to that, I'll hand it over to you now, but thank you both.
Yeah, thank you so much, and extra special greetings to each and everyone in Zoom land today. Right now it's around lunchtime, and I have a fruit and a vegetable is not enough for your lunch. But because of COVID, we are all encouraged to stay home, stay home, stay home. As a result of that, we are forced to think about our food supply. How reliable is our food supply? If we have been encouraged to stay home, how reliable is our food supplies? But before I get into that, I want to do a quick health check because we are encouraged to stay home. How reliable? Because I came to Canada as a migrant farm worker to produce food. And I want to do a quick health check to make sure that I've been producing healthy food and that right now you're healthy. In school, I was taught that our body is made up of 11 systems, right? Let us do a quick health check. SS, our skeletal system, how strong are our bones? Are we able to exercise our muscles, our skeleton, or are we, most of the time, our posture is just sitting or lying down, what it is like? The CS, circulatory system, how well is that working? Is that healthy? And you know, health is extra important these days, right? Our muscular system, have we been able to exercise or are we been able to eat more and put on more weight? IS, our immune system, which all the systems are important, but this one is extra important these days. How healthy is your immune system? So before I end, if there's anyone who is not healthy and if your immune system is not strong because of the kind of foods that migrant workers produce, please get to me before I end. But I want to tell you, COVID-19 hasn't done anything more than expose what we've been talking about all along. It has, according to somebody, COVID-19 has exposed Canada's dirty secret. And what is that dirty secret? It is all around us. I'll just enlighten you a little more. But what COVID-19 has also done, the group that Chris and I are affiliated to, Justice for Migrant Workers, we are just a collective. What COVID-19 has done, it has turned Justice for Migrant Workers into an emergency room of a hospital. COVID-19 has put a lot of pressure on our resources. COVID-19 has spread us far, wide, and very thin. I want to tell you, the food that you eaten, the program that brought me to Canada, the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program and all Temporary Foreign Workers Program, according to one political party, they put that so nice. These programs are so complicated, they're difficult to understand, So I want you to bear with me. They're so complicated that they're very difficult to navigate, very difficult. And they're so complicated that it is impossible to get justice. That's the program. That's the food that we put on the table. And for you to understand that, you'll see that, look at the recipe for exploitation. Look at the recipes. You'll see that there's a lot of force. There's a lot of unjust laws, fear, power, influence. There's also ignorance. There's also poverty. There's also propaganda, privilege. There are lots of myths. All of that are webbed into those things, making it difficult to understand. You'll also get to understand that these programs and the system that we're in, it talks a lot about rights, who have rights and who don't have rights, and who have privileges and who don't have privileges. And you'll also get to understand that the food that we produce, what are people planting? What are people picking? What are people packaging? What are people processing? When you go to the restaurants, what are people preparing? What are people caring for those foods? What are people doing the distribution? All of these are people of color. All of these are people who earn minimum wage. They have precarious status. We work long hours. We are not unionized. Can you imagine the working conditions associated with non-unionized work? That is what my story is about. But because most of y'all, I hope everybody's from the Caribbean, I want to tell you, I'm from St. Lucia, as you heard, and being a migrant farm worker, I can tell you, as a result of being in Canada, I discovered that I am many things. And I'm hoping to touch some of these here. That I discovered that I am a God. I discovered that I am an angel. I discovered that I'm a slave. I discovered that I'm a half human. And I've also discovered that I'm a lab rat in Canada. I want to tell you, my tone of voice has changed because I am not a messenger to sugarcoat it for you, nor will I what I done for it. So I hope you bear with me. So let us go to the other phase then. Before I came to Canada, my father was arrested for stealing a cow. My father said he never stole a cow. He said one day he saw a really nice rope. I hope that looks like a nice rope. He said he saw a really nice rope. And I hope y'all are Western who like stories. He saw a really nice rope and he decided to pick up that rope and drag the rope home, drag it home, drag it home, drag it home. And when he got home, he decided to check the other end of the rope. Can I check the other end of my rope? When he checked the other end of the rope, he said he saw something looking like this. He never stole a cow, but he saw something look like this. Does that look like a cow, a Canadian cow? I tried to get the identical cow, but I don't have enough time to go to St. Lucia and get the real cow for you. But as I go through that story, do you want to hear more about how COVID has affected my father or how it has affected migrant workers in Canada? I want you to take off your shoes and put yourself in the place of migrant workers and tell us whether this represents fair conditions, just conditions, and as a result of COVID, whether COVID has made it easier or more difficult. And if you have a closer look at me, you can see I have the biggest and most expensive chain in Canada. Why is that so? Being a migrant worker in Canada, the conditions are really tough, and they're rough, they're tough and heavy around our necks, and it's just like our chain. And these are some of the things I want to tell you about. Now, I want to tell you about myself. You didn't come to listen to my father. I want to tell you, I came to Canada. I didn't just come to Canada. Had I come to Canada, I would be a tourist, I would be a visitor, but I was forced to come to Canada. And that's what migrants are. We are forced to leave our homeland. We've been hearing about mineral extraction and exploitation and so many things happening in the global south. These are the things, these are the activities that push us away from our country. What are the three key things that push me into Canada? Global inequality. Don't we have sufficient resources for everybody's need? Do we have enough for anyone's greed? And that is what our issues are. Global inequality. And I'm pretty sure you're familiar with that documentary, Life, L-I-F-E, and Debt, D-E-B-T. And that spells out some of the real things that create that wide divide. If you take Canada, for example, Canada is estimated to have anything between half to 3/4 of the world's supply of fresh water. How many communities right now, at this very present moment, are without that basic right, without water? So it's a question, is it a question of Canada not having enough water, or is it a question of how these resources are used or misused, or how they're controlled? So I was forced to come to Canada because of global inequality. I was forced to come to Canada because of ED, environmental destruction. In my home country, I was doing 5 different things. And I felt so confident that my income was diversified doing 5 different things. I was so confident. But just one hurricane pulled the carpet and I was left stranded. What are countries causing global warming and climate change? What are countries paying the price? I was forced to come to Canada because of a hurricane, environmental destruction. I was forced to come to Canada because of WTO, the World Trade Organization. And this is just one of many institutions that create that wide divide, that global inequality. In a nutshell, in my home country, banana was the main crop. And because of the WTO, America challenges, how can those small guys have preference on the European market? Because of that institution, they rule that the playing field is not level. It should be a level and open market. So we cannot compete with the giant of America. So literally they push us away from the land. They push us away from the land, creating high unemployment, forcing us to come to Canada. What do we get when we come to Canada? What do we get in? What did I get when I got to Canada? But before I tell you, I want to tell you, in Canada, and look at that. We are forced to come to Canada, but look at that. And that's enshrined in Canadian law. Enshrined in Canada. Who's a migrant worker? We are denied. You can call a migrant worker in Canada denied. Who is a migrant worker in Canada? Denied. We are denied the right to vote. So the same politicians creating those unjust laws and policies, you cannot touch them. They are untouchable. We cannot vote. Being a migrant worker, and that's enshrined in Canadian law, it means that you're denied the right to participate in culture and family life. Denied the right to participate in culture and family life. Does that make me a human being, or doesn't that make us a half human being? I'm talking about it. Consistently, Canada always have programs that dehumanize and exploit people. Consistently. I can prove that to you with time. Being a migrant worker in Canada means that you are denied the right to be protected by ordinary labor standards. You're denied the right to access adequate and comprehensive healthcare, and so on and so on. Does that make us a full human being? What does that make us? And where is that? That's enshrined in Canadian law. The law. Who are the ones Who are the ones the politicians loyal to? You, the voter, me, the worker, or their donors? Who are the politicians loyal to? The other thing I want to tell you is, I'm not doing PowerPoint, but I'm doing props. The program that brought me to Canada, it's like a telephone number. Today, I want you to dial a number with your telephone number. The program that brought me to Canada is like a telephone number. The program that brought me to Canada is also like a tree. How did this to work? I don't know. Let me see. Let me go to the telephone number. That tree, that program that brought me to Canada is the Seasonal Agriculture Workers Program. This year, that program is 54 years old. That's in the telephone. I'm going to the telephone again. The number 3 in that program, in that telephone number, they represent the 3 simple parts of the tree, the 3 pillars of the program that brings migrant workers to harvest, to produce your food. What are the 3 simple parts of the tree? The stem, the branches, the leaves. I am in Canada. We are in Canada because of the stem of that tree. And what is the stem of that tree? We are here to do jobs Canadians do not want to do. Look at this year, I'm pretty sure, and from last year, I'm pretty sure unemployment might be at its highest. So many people lose their job because of COVID. I was expecting, oh, so many Canadians unemployed, they would take up the slack in the production of food. They would go to the farms and produce the food. Why? Why do migrant workers still have to come to Canada when employment is so high? It simply tells you because the conditions are not right. So we are here to do jobs Canadians do not want to do. What does the branches mean? We cannot apply for status. And what is status? What is status in Canada? What does status means in Canada? If you have status, you have rights. If you don't have status, it means that you are denied basic human rights, you are denied basic labor standards. So we are here to do those jobs Canadians do not want to do. We do not have status. We are denied basic human rights, basic employment, labor standards. What are the leaves? The 3rd part of the tree, the leaves. We are tied to our employer to do the dirty work. We are tied to our employer by way of a tied work permit and also a contract. We are tied to our employer to do those dirty jobs. And at the same time, being denied basic human rights, being denied basic labor standards. That's the food that you eat. That's the food that you eat. Now, how is it presented to you? How is that presented to you? It's presented to you in such a nice way. This is the most glittering bag I've ever seen in Canada. That's how it's presented to you. And how is it really presented to you? Buy local. Buy local. And when you buy local, you're thinking of freshness, good health, supporting the local economy. But today I want to go and shop with you and open that bag, our buy local bag. I want to tell you that with the fruits that you buy, the vegetables, the food that you buy, once migrant workers are involved in the production of these fruits, these vegetables, the wine in Niagara Falls, all those seafoods in PEI, once migrant workers are involved, let us open that bag today. When you do that, Canada is saying to those sending countries to send me people who are Black, who are brown, people of color. So that is a racial program already. Number 2, Canada is saying, send me people of color, but send me those people of color and English is like a second language to them or they're illiterate. Send me people of color, send me people who struggle with English. And the 3rd thing is, send me those people who are of color, who struggle with English, and they are ignorant. They know nothing about labor issues and human rights issues. These are the people I can play and exploit with. Isn't that the formula for exploitation? What kind of system would supply a country with those kind of people? What kind of system are we talking about? What happens now when we come to Canada? Canada would welcome us in a climate of fear. And there's a lot of fear built in our program. I don't know if I have time to tell you all about it. There's a lot of fear built in the program. Canada welcomes us in a climate of fear. And to keep us compliant and submissive, there's a lot of fear built in the program. One example of such fear, how fear is created, is our employer controls, they own and control the travel agency that book our flights in and out of Canada. The moment you speak up, it's so easy for them to book your flight out. So there's a lot of fear. That's just one of so many ways. So they welcome us in a climate of fear, and that is to keep us compliant and submissive. And what is Canada known as? Canada is known on the world stage, not only as a gentleman on the world stage, but they are also known as a country with a culture of silence. Everything is okay. The culture of silence. Who does speak up? That is why I will decide whether I'll punish you, everybody here, or whether I'll reward everybody here. Because of your silence, I didn't know these injustices exist in the production of food in Canada. And is that illegal or legal? All of these things are happening in Canada and they are legal. Who are the politicians loyal to? You, the voter, me, the worker, or the donors? So I was telling you, in a nutshell, that I was forced to come to Canada. Migrant workers are forced to come to Canada. Now, how has COVID impacted us, migrant workers in Canada? I want to touch briefly, and my colleague will tell you a little more. I want to tell you the OECS, Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad. I want to touch each of them separately. Tell me whether these countries have been bullied into the reaction have been bullied as a result of bullying or as a result of being resilient. Let us go. Let me take the OECS. Some workers from the OECS, they were fighting back, pushing back. And in St. Lucia, you know what they described as? They are AWOL. They went AWOL. As a result of that, you know what is the government's reaction? As a result of fighting back against unjust conditions, you know what measure the government is taking? That to be on the program, to participate in the program, you must deposit a sum of money. I'm not too sure of the figure, but I'm pretty sure it is a significant figure that would guarantee you can only get it back upon return. What does that say? Is that being bullied into a situation, or is that being resilient? I want to talk about Jamaicans. As a result of COVID, for the first time, as a result of COVID, the workers from Jamaica, and Jamaica has a very significant, in terms of participants in the program, it's a very significant number of workers from Jamaica. They're asked to sign a waiver, basically freeing the government. The government is saying, go at your own risk. It's a legal program. You're expecting the government, the same people you expect to be having your backs, watching your back, standing in your corner, they're telling you, go at your own risk. Is that the result? Is that the Jamaicans, are they being bullied or are they being resilient? I want to tell you about the Barbadians. As a result of COVID, I came across some Barbadian workers. They come to Canada to work in the hotel industry. The workers, because of COVID, the place of work was closed and they were laid off. They are laid off. Imagine the government representative is connecting them to us to provide them with food. The government representative is connecting to us. Who are we? We are just a collective. We are not a union. We are not a nonprofit. We are not this, that. We are just a collective of volunteers, and they're connecting them to us to provide them with food. If you allow me to tell you about the housing, and there are 20 injustices, which is in my telephone number, but I won't have time to tell you about them, but I'll just tell you about housing. Out of the 20 injustices, the housing, one, it is overcrowded. Now, just that word, overcrowded. Isn't that the recipe for COVID to spread like wildfire? The housing is overcrowded. It is below standard. Imagine the Barbadians. Imagine there are people who are 60 years and they're asked to climb on a bunk bed. 60-year-olds are asked to climb on a bunk. In our home country, a bunk bed is a child's bed. That's not a grown-up bed, an adult bed. 60-year-olds asked to climb on a bunk bed. And hear that. The roof, the ceiling of the house, the bedroom is so low that when you climb on the bunk bed, you cannot even sit on the bed. There's some workers who are claustrophobic, and and the rooms are small. Can you imagine just the living condition? And in a nutshell, that's what it is. That is what the programs are. Both the living and the working conditions are not humane. We are half humans in Canada. And I want to tell you also, I want to touch a little about Trinidadians. Trinidadians come on the program, the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program. And under that program, you can come to Canada to work. And on that program, the maximum amount of time you can spend in Canada is 8 months. At the end of your contract, 8 months, you have to return home. And according to that program, by the 15th of December, everybody who's on that program have to be back home by the 15th of December. For the first time, Trinidadians are caught stranded in Canada. 15th of December, they cannot go home. Why? The borders are closed, there are no flights. So look at that. Look at the scenario now. The borders are closed, they cannot go home. They've never, ever spent winter in Canada. They do not have the right clothing. They're unemployed because most of these workers were working out in the fields, apples, whatever, in the fields. So at that time of the year, there's no field work because of frost and snow and so on. There's no field work. So they're not working, not earning an income. Never spent winter in Canada, do not have the right clothing, and no flights home. And that is the situation. And for the first time now, they're face to face with EI. You've told me before, we cannot access EI because to access EI, you have to be in the country, be available for work. And now the Trinidadians are saying, hey, here's my situation. I cannot go home. Here am I in Canada. I am ready to work, but my work permit, my contract has ended. What do you do with me? Do you think the government would just roll out a carpet and say, yes, I understand your situation? It's because of constant pressure. And that is one of the things I mean when I tell you COVID has put us under pressure. It has spread us far, wide, and thin. In a nutshell, so Trinidad, were they bullied into a situation or they were being resilient? And in closing, before I hand to Chris, I want to compare to Cuba, Haiti, and I want to quote somebody. Cuba, we heard in just the previous, and I'm pretty sure other presentation, that there's a price we pay for standing up, for being resilient, for fighting. There's a price to pay. Haiti, the first successful slave revolt country. And when you hear in mainstream media, they're so proud to say that Haiti is the poorest in the Western Hemisphere. Why? Because anywhere Black is involved, they do not want success to be associated with. And I want to close with this person, Dr. Walter Rodney. I want to remind you that it's only our hands are needed in Canada to produce and not our bodies. I want to tell you that Dr. Walter Rodney said, are you going to use your knowledge to maintain the status quo, or are you going to commit class suicide? So now I pass on to Chris to build on. I hope that I set the foundation that you can build on to understand why our situation, the situation of migrant workers is so dire in Canada. And as I said, as somebody said, COVID-19 has exposed Canada's dirty secret. Chris, I pass it on to you.
Thank you. How y'all doing? Everybody's all right? I want to give a shout out to that presentation that we saw beforehand. It was fantastic. It was amazing. So that was really great, very intellectually stimulating. And I think just to start off from that positionality, when we're thinking about the crisis, the so-called crisis in the Caribbean, that the Caribbean governance system is always in a disaster, that Caribbean people cannot get their act together. And this is why the need for different forms of foreign intervention, whether it's through the nonprofit industrial complex or through direct capitalist interventions or military interventions. And I want us to think about the migration schemes of the seasoned agricultural worker program or the temporary foreign worker program in that light. It's an appendage of a system of migration that's not based on individual choices. Now, both the Trinidadians and the Jamaicans that Gabriel mentioned earlier, if you looked at the Caribbean context, the media discourse around both their arrival and the inability to return last year during the COVID crisis, the COVID crisis, of course, is ongoing. We saw this idea of free choice, that all these fellas and these women had a free choice to come up to Canada, and they knew what they were getting themselves into, right? So number one, the idea of free choice. Number two, this idea of knowing. And number three, consent. Of accepting condition, that you sure know what you're going to get to when the crisis is going on. So from all of us who are currently facing this crisis in the across the world, but here in the Ontario, we know that the crisis has not gone anywhere. The crisis continues, and at the current time, there are 20 farms that are having outbreaks. There's 17 food processing places. There's about 4,000 to 5,000 workers throughout the COVID. Let's see, 2,707 farm workers have tested positive. 2,687 workers in the food processing industry. So over 5,000 workers within the last year have tested positive for COVID. We know of 3 have died. And why I'm saying we know of 3, because we don't know. We don't have the full statistics or data of how many people actually did die. We don't know how many people returned home with COVID. We know of a few workers who did. And we don't know of people who are now home in Trinidad or Jamaica or Barbados or the Organization of Caribbean States whose situation got worse as a result of COVID and are not able to work again. But we do know that COVID is still rampant on farms, and that there's been no changes. And why I wanted to talk about the ideas of free choice and consent, and this idea of civility with the so-called contract. The contract I want us to understand. So the workers sign a contract. There's annual negotiations that take place between the governments of the Caribbean and Canada every year. The agreement is called the Seasoned Agricultural Workers Program. And when we think of contracts, we think of things that are undertaken between, or contracts are signed between 2 equal partners. And I want us to disrupt this idea. These contracts are based on power imbalances and based on a system of trying to support a plantation economy here in the global north. And what I mean by this, just to talk a bit more about what Gabriel was saying around housing. Now, through media exposés, through different reports, it's been quite heightened, the awareness that agricultural workers live in congregate housing. It's not that it is chosen. It's not that workers somehow in the Caribbean live in very crappy places in the Caribbean and just want to love to live in crappy places in Ontario. That is absolute nonsense. It's garbage. It's BS. What in fact is taking place is twofold. Number one is that agricultural dwellings, employer-provided housing, is exempt from any form of legal protections. So the Landlord-Tenant Act in Ontario is called the Residential Tenancies Act. Agricultural workers are exempt. So there is no transparency, there's no appeals mechanism, there's nothing where the workers can try to air grievances for the housing congregations, congregate housing that exists. Number 2, when our quote unquote good friends from both the provincial and the federal government come forward, they're going to tell you that they've set up such stringent oversight that work to approve the housing process. Before a worker arrives in Canada, they have to have a tied work permit where they are employed by one farm. And they're supposed to get a job offer. The very fancy terminology is labor market impact assessment. So the federal government claims that they inspect farms before providing a LMIA. And in our experience, just till this week, we're still getting complaints of workers living in terrible, crowded housing with not proper sanitation, without proper sewage, without proper bathrooms. And the federal government continues to do inspections by employers providing video, pictures, which could be up to 3 years old. All right, so it doesn't reflect the reality that's going on right now. So it's just not ignorant. It's just not stupidity. It's just not that workers do not know their rights. There is a significant power imbalance that exists because you're tied federally at a work permit where you're tied to one employer, but also corresponding legislation at the provincial level, which denies workers basic rights. So employment standards, workers have very minimal protections. Most of the Employment Standards Act in Ontario does not cover agricultural workers. Our Occupational Health and Safety Act exempts many sections of the act for the protection of agricultural workers as well too. And on top of that, agricultural workers, you cannot form unions in Ontario for farm workers. This is a ruling from the Supreme Court in the Fraser case, but also the Dunmore case from 2000, 2001, and 2008. So agricultural workers do not have the right to collectively bargain or to try to take the dynamics in the workplace. So there's a duality of a plantation system that's happening that denies workers the ability to exert their rights and the ability to change their conditions at work. And there were multiple outcries and public outcries during the COVID pandemic to ensure this happens. But in fact, what we saw was that big business, what instead happened, what clamped down. They made sure that no, there was no reforms as we're currently seeing around the paid sick days debacle. There was no steps taken to improve any of the conditions, whether it's hazard pay, sick pay, reforms to the Occupational Health and Safety Act, changes to the living conditions. And in fact, many of the farms that were operating and continue to operate carte blanche. Now, the argument that's been used right from the beginning is that if these agricultural industries did not stop operating, Canada would have a food crisis, that our so-called food sovereignty, which was misused, would be threatened. And this, in fact, is not true. Which many people may not know, that a lot of the crops that temporary foreign workers or particularly seasonal agricultural workers work on is for export production. And within the last year, our export production, the value of our export production commodities increased from 68 to, I believe, $74 billion. So during the COVID crisis, a lot of farms made a sweet buck off of the toil and labor of our sisters and brothers. So that's definitely number one. Number two, unbeknownst to most people, in December 2020, right in the height of when peeps were about to go on the holiday season, the Canadian government expanded the different commodities, or they expanded the amount of commodities that migrant workers could be employed on through the Season Agricultural Worker Program. And these were in areas of maple syrup production, which Canada is a huge exporter of. So once again, it's not about protecting food sovereignty. It's not about protecting our food system, and it's not ensuring that our system will face, we will not have a dire crisis in our food system. It's about protecting profits and an export system that on one side steals the wealth of labor from the global south, but then dumps through unfair capitalist and an unequal trade system that's operated for generations, dumps crops to destroy the local economies of people in the global south. So understanding that that's what basically is happening is that during the COVID crisis, we've seen the expansion of trade opportunities, the devaluation of labor standards, and also the expansion of the ability for employers to bring workers to Canada during the crisis under the misnomer of essential work. What has been the response from both the community and the worker community, both so the overall community and the workers? So return to the Trinidadian workers, and the way that Justice for Migrant Workers, we're an all activist group. In fact, it takes up most of our time. And I'm actually going to pause for a second before I continue, because I think it's also critically important for us to remember that 2 workers died this week. One worker was from Trinidad, the other was from Mexico. One of the workers we as an organization knew for many years. He was an Apple worker who worked in Windsor, Essex. He worked in Kitchener-Waterloo, and he worked in the London area. So I want us to remember him. He was a father of 2 and somebody who we knew quite well. And there was a brother who worked, a Mexican brother who worked in Port Elgin, who died in the production of vegetables. So lives continue to be lost, and we cannot at any point forget that this is happening. Now, with the Trinidadian workers, it's important for us to know that the way we do our work, it's through trust, through relationships, and it's long-term. Now, I've been doing this since as an undergrad, in my second part of undergrad at U of T in Caribbean Studies. So for 20 years, I've been doing outreach to farms. And for us, it's about building these long-term strengths. It's about when we show up to a farm, when we show up to a community, it's not having an immediate response or immediate answer. It's about ensuring that there's long-term organizing that's happening. And many of these same Trinidadian workers have gone on long marches for us. They've been organizing with us. Together, we've pushed for changes around employment insurance, or the unemployment insurance benefits. And it's been through collective actions, through organizing, through legal strategies, and embarrassing the hell of Canada, as well as the Caribbean countries, of why there are changes that are happening. So with the Trinidadian crisis that happened at the end of December last year, actually, let's say from October till December of last year, many of the workers came forward, both anonymously and also basically had their voices heard, to say that, one, the employer system, the employer-tied system, where workers are tied to one employer, indentured labor, doesn't work. Basically, we lost our jobs, we're not able to work, we cannot return home. Why continue to humiliate and dehumanize us in a system that doesn't give us the ability to work to provide for our families. Number two, we cannot collect our entitlement benefits, employment insurance, which workers have paid for over 54 years into this system. Let me be clear. People are going to tell you the farm workers are coming to teeth off of our system. They're trying to live off and be lazy. And that sure as hell's not happening. I can assure you that for decades, Caribbean farm workers and Mexican farm workers have building into the foundation of our social safety net hundreds of millions of dollars. And the workers took that same message to the government to say that workers in their time of crisis, whether here in Canada or the home country, should have access to the benefits. So a lot of pressure was put on the government and they had to renege. It wasn't what we all wanted, but it gave us the ability to have victories to push forward on our organizing work. The other aspect that Gabriel talked a little bit about was other forms of resistance. At some of these farms, when there was a COVID outbreak and the employers had attempted to try to get the workers to return to work, their workers refused to work. They basically held sit-in strikes or sit-in acts of resistance, we can call this, to say, if you're not going to make this workplace safer, we're not returning to work. In other workplaces, workers around chemicals, around pesticides, around other forms of chemicals that are destroying their lives, and I'll get to why that's very important in a second, they basically stopped work. They called on the community to put pressure to ensure that the employers will be held accountable. And those actions, those small actions, were quite successful as well too. As an organization, Gabriel also alluded to this food crisis. Now, once again, I mentioned $74 billion of an export value. Many of these employers are very rich. They're wealthy industries. These are not the so-called mom and pop farms, the mythology of the Canadian agriculture that is so important in developing this false narrative of what Canadian food system is. So these are large operations. The employers aren't going hungry, but the workers are. And as an act of solidarity, we've partnered with different organizations to ensure that we got food to workers. Not to be like, you poor workers, we're here to feed you in your time of need, but as another tool of organizing, to try to build part of the organizing and resistance on farms, and to talk about the hypocrisy of a multi-billion-dollar industry, while the people who are picking our fruits and vegetables, working in our cannabis industry, continue to starve, one, because of crappy labor legislation, but also because of the unfair laws that exist currently in our society, but also during COVID pandemic. All right, so we engage on different campaigns of solidarity, food solidarity, that continues today. Gabriel has been going out to farms across Ontario, in Windsor, Essex, Elizabeth Haw, and the peeps down there week after week. And I believe Elizabeth is out there today getting food to workers. And also we've been taking on fights when workers have been terminated. Some of you might be aware that during the COVID crisis, migrant farm workers were not allowed to leave their farms, and many are still not to leave their farms, okay? They're facing perpetual curfews, they cannot shop, they're having wages deducted for their groceries, which we believe is a form of wage theft. So we recently had a case at the Labor Relations Board of one worker, his name was Kenny, who fought an important fight, and let's see how that goes. So all these are important steps of a longer term process of collective organizing. We can't look at these small steps that we've been taking for close to 2 decades as small, as the be all end all. It's about fighting for larger demands. And I just want to close, if you could just put in the chat box, how much time do I have left? So anybody could just let me know, or if you could just shout out. All right, nobody? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry?
No, I was gonna say you're under time, so there's still Q&A, so it's up to you. You can wrap up whenever you want.
All right, brother, how much do I have? About 5 minutes or 10 minutes?
Oh, you have more than that because we started late, so.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, let me get to the chemical component. So actually under occupational health and safety laws, you would think that there would be real protections against pesticides and chemicals. And that in fact is not the case. So there is no what we call industry-specific regulations, which means that the employers, there is no protections. Employers do not necessarily have to identify to the Ministry of Labor what the chemicals are being used, and there are no proactive steps to make those places safe. All right, and it's not just simply a health and safety issue. We are in a current discourse of talking about environmental racism in Canada. And it's important for us to understand the disproportional impact of occupational hazards, such as pesticides and chemicals, as a form of environmental racism, something that's systemic, something that is colonial, and something that is also imperialist, because the same pesticides that we're using in Canada, and even the ones that are no longer allowed in Canada, are basically transported to people in the global south. The Guardian had an article a couple weeks back, and y'all could go check it out, about the people in Sri Lanka who are using a chemical, and many people are dying from these dangerous chemicals. So in the global south, we're seeing the imperialist notions of how our chemicals, our agricultural industry is being used to subvert and to destroy local economies, not just through food production, but through the dangerous chemicals that our communities are being subjected to. Now, what are the demands, and how the hell did we come up with the idea of status on arrival? And I want us to think about the conversation about status upon arrival as a dialogue. Now, when y'all hear that, you're like, well, yes, that might make sense, that may not make sense. So previous to the arrival of Caribbean farm workers in 1966, Canada had implemented different forms of labor regimes. We have this idea that Canada faces a perpetual labor shortage. And the narrative, one of the narratives about the Caribbean workers is that they'll accept any job because they're hard workers and they don't mind the hot weather, And this is used as a narrative or a mythology to not expand or increase labor protections. And for me, this type of racial tropes is not just offensive, but it's a systemic way of trying to deny humanity to large swaths of people, okay? So with the arrival of workers from the Dutch, from the Netherlands, or the Polish, prior to the arrival of the Caribbean workers in the 60s, they did not face the same labor restrictions. They were not tied to the employer. The Dutch, for instance, and the English previously to them, who all came as farm workers, came as permanent status. They could work on a farm and then they could leave a farm. And many of them, what you saw, are the farmers today. That is why you see so many Dutch people who are farmers. A lot of these peeps came with permanent status in the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. Let's say the 40s and 50s, not the 60s. Now, it's only with the arrival of Black workers from the Caribbean that we saw the shift. We saw the change, and this is where we saw the restrictions. So on one side, employers are using our immigration laws to divide workers. Now, in 1966, we talked about the start of the program that brought in the Caribbean workers. In 72, that went to the OECS, 74, Mexico. And then in the early 2000s, we expanded to the seasonal agricultural worker to other industries, which is now called the Temporary Foreign Worker Program. And as another important fact, which you may or may not know, as of February this year, I believe only 28% of people arrived to Canada as permanent residents. So we saw an entire shift of our immigration system to once again to meet the needs of capitalists and not actually building communities. So our call for status upon arrival is a couple-fold. Number one, to take away the employer's power to divide workers and to use the laws to try to subordinate working class peoples. Number two is to show that the hypocrisy of a process of racialization, where white workers were able to come as free laborers, but only with the importation and arrival of Caribbean workers, we saw the shift in our dynamics and basically the bonding of Caribbean workers. Number three, I want to make it clear that when we talk about status upon arrival, it's not about saying that all farm workers want to come to Canada. Part of the discourse is about the right to stay, the right to move. It's not about the abolition of the program in its current manifestation. And what I mean by that is people's livelihood in the home country, whether it's a farmer, whether it's working in a manufacturing facility, whatever the job is, they should have the opportunity to do that in their home country. They shouldn't be subjected to the whims of free trade agreements, which are destroying, and the root policies of the IMF and World Bank that are destroying and coercing people to move and to migrate to the global north. So it's ensuring that people have the ability to work and live in their home countries if they so choose to, but also that they do not come to Canada under the system that brought many of our families to the Caribbean as indentured laborers. So this is why we keep saying this system as well too. There's been a few current updates, and I would, and I know people are probably exhausted. I want to entertain some questions and get to some of the recent changes that I would like to basically condemn at will. So I'll turn it over to y'all, and then we'll have a longer conversation.
Okay, so I just wanted to thank you, Chris and Gabriel, for all of that, for the the initial presentation that Gabriel had. Made me rethink all the time that I've invested in my PowerPoints all of these years, where we need to get you to come and teach us how to do that with the props. That was incredible, Gabriel. And Chris for giving the updates on the side, and to hear about the two workers that passed very recently, right? About how this is something that's very current. You're not talking about something that has happened before, that this is continuing. So we actually do have time for Q&A. So it's up to you in terms of how long we want to go. I realize that we're technically supposed to be finishing around this time, but we're running around 15-20 minutes late. So if folks need to jump off the call, we totally understand. But if people would like to stay around to ask some questions to Chris and Gabriel, that would be great. So we can open it up. Yep.
Yeah, please do, right? We have time. Let's just take it. Let's take some questions and have a thorough conversation.
Okay, so I think based off, again, the people that we have in the room, I don't see any unfamiliar names. It's a lot of students, faculty, friends of the program. So if there are any questions that are here, just let us know and we can unmute you and we could turn the camera on if you want, or you could type it into the text box and we could pass it. So.
Oh boy. Okay, you mind if I just start off with this? So the first question about fundraising. Gabriel, you want to say something, and then I'll jump in about fundraising because it's important to talk about this.
Fundraising?
I'm going to get into that stuff, right? I know you wanted to jump in.
Oh, I just want to share some good news. Just this during our presentation there a couple of minutes ago. If you've been looking in my background, there's a worker there. He's a migrant worker. He's one of the first I am associated with who got a vulnerable work permit. And that is because of our work. And he just got news from his employer, not his employer, his lawyer, just got news. He's from the Valley, related to me, that he got status.
Okay. All right. So I want us to remember the project of Canada, right? And let's basically start by unpacking multiculturalism. So we know that multiculturalism is a very divisive policy. It doesn't address power imbalances. It spends too much time talking about saris and samosas and soca, but not about talking about structural racism and white supremacy that permeates our institutions. And very much what the federal government currently is doing. All right, I'm sorry for y'all there about the wonderful news. I am going to have to be Chris Ramsford and pour some bad hot pepper on all of our celebrations very soon, okay? Sorry, y'all. But the policy of the multiculturalism in Canada has always been to perpetuate a system of perpetualism, a system that ignores its colonial relationships to the global South and does not address power relationships, okay? And what's currently happening is that the federal government, for many years, has never funded projects for organizations like Justice for Migrant Workers. And a lot of times people are going to be like, well, we should just basically take money from the federal government, right? So let me tell you what so far the approach of Justicia, and I'm the Scrooge of the group, right? I'm like the people, I think people they cuss me probably, I think, a little too much, right, for being who I am. But I've always been afraid and concerned about government money, all right? And there's a reason why. So government money has been used to try to, subvert any type of radical imagination or radical politics, first and foremost. Number two, once you get money from the federal government, it also, as I see, weakens the demands that people are trying to put forward. And the third context that's happening right now is that you've got all these organizations trying to grab all this money. They're basically trying to cut each other's throat. And that the fight then becomes not about workers and worker struggles, but about appeasing to the interests of the government. And this is important about this conversation about fundraising, right? Because at this point, we don't take money from employers or corporations. It's a lot of it's just basically grassroots funding. We've received some foundational support. There was a food grant that came through Food Share, and something that came through a local people down in the Windsor Essex that came courtesy of the United Way, and I'll critique the United Way in a bit. But it was all for food production and distribution of local stuff. But we don't get paid for all that we're doing, and we don't take money from the government to try to develop ourselves into a nonprofit or a part of the complex. And this is because of the concern about the way that it de-radicalizes. Now, I'm an older guy now, and definitely it's harder to sustain a family and to do this. So it's definitely some rethinking about how do we sustain ourselves, how do we survive, how do we don't get sick as we grow older. But it's about trying to think about what are the alternative forms of monetary. So direct grants. So people for some reason be giving us money on PayPal. I have no idea who these people are. But people are finding us and giving us some money. Labor unions have been giving us some. As I said, we've had some grants, both through academic, but also different foundational support. But for us to make sure that there's no strings attached and it doesn't conflict with our critiques of capitalism, of colonialism. And let me just give you a couple of, Denise, that's actually, what they will. Right? They want to basically, even the people that they hate the most, right? They want to basically make all of us part of the industrial complex. And the way they do this is through different ways. They invite you to the consultation process. They invite you to sit on their committees. They invite you to have longer conversations. Then the money starts coming. So it's a multiple ways that the industrial complex will try to do that. And let me give you an example. So I was UTSU president back in the day, before it was called UTSU. And I'll talk to you what the university did later, right, about how they always try to co-opt us as student activists. I'll talk about that later. But there's always ways that they do try to, and they're never going to forget or forgive. So they're never going to stop to try to do that, right? So, and the other very dangerous part about this is they'll get every organization that's getting funding to diss justicia or diss justice for migrant workers, and to try to make us to see as the extremists or the people who don't know what's going on. So this long history, this tradition of organizing for 20 years, that's led to those vulnerable permits. And brother and comrade, congratulations. I'm gonna talk a little bit about the history of that too, all right? But there's a longer history of resistance that leads to this stuff. The government erases that. Non-government organizations and academia also play a pivotal role in trying to erase this resistance. So it's about us telling these type of stories moving forward. So thank you. That's such an important, critical question about fundraising and the role that the industrial complex works.
So I'm just gonna unmute. So as Anetta said, just put your hand up or let us know, and we'll be able to unmute you to ask a question.
Okay, while we wait, I'm going to keep talking at you. All right. Now, this vulnerable work permit. All right. So Canada just recently announced that there's a so-called new pathways to residency for 90,000 people. I'm sure all of you heard that, right? And by some segments of the mainstream community, they mimicked this request and said that this is a fantastic, awesome step taken by the federal government that acknowledges the work of essential workers. Mm-hmm. I'm just going to bundle the whole thing down and say that's absolute stupidness. Okay? Now, what Canada, once again, and I keep talking about the role of the state, is divide and rule. All right? So part of this way, and the way that Canada undertakes the way they excluded people, we're no longer going to say that Black workers from the Caribbean cannot apply, right? Or Mexican workers or Guatemalan workers cannot apply. We use language restrictions. We use economic ways to try to disproportionately target particular communities, okay? So this recent announcement, 90,000 people can apply. Most of them will be health professionals. Most people will be people who are studying in universities or colleges. People can have to spend lots of monies to consultants and lawyers. I think I estimated $8,000 a pop, and then you multiply by 90,000 people. That's a lot of dinero, man. That's a lot of ducats that somebody's going to be making. And that ain't going to help any of our tuition fees. Okay, y'all? Let me tell you that. Now, it's a divide in the rule because most of the agricultural workers, they have to compete with people in 90 other categories. So all the contribution that workers have been providing for 20 to 30 years, the skills as laborers are not going to be accepted, okay? They're looking if you could pass a test that's very, very hard to pass, which in itself excludes thousands of Caribbean workers. Number one, most of the Mexican and Guatemalan workers may also possess challenges of English literacy, right, or English language. They're not going to be able to pass that English test as well, too. So, and this type of division is what we saw many years ago during the caregiver organizing, where the previous conservative government had undertaken some small crumbs at the caregiver community, and same with the liberal regimes before that. But they always had an exceptionalism to the Caribbean and the Mexican farm workers. And this is rooted in the idea that low-skilled workers have nothing to contribute to our society. So we've got to diss that straight up. This system is flawed, it's wrong. And what we keep saying about permanent status upon arrival is how we're trying to reform the debate that nobody should be considered de-skilled or devalued for what's happening here in Canada. Now, why? For my brother who just got his vulnerable work permit, that is heroic, that is courageous, and that is incredible, okay? It's important that these workers are getting it. Sadly, I've had some other brothers who haven't been able to get it. And it's very much arbitrary how some people are getting it, number one. And number two, the expectation for all our comrades is after this 1 year on an open permit, they have to find a closed permit afterwards. So if y'all were on the Titanic and we're basically all going down the ship, we've given a few people to lifeboats, but there ain't going to be no ships to pick them up after we've given some people some lifeboats. So it's, you know, there's little cracks in the system that's happening because of courageous steps taken by these comrades. But we've got to make sure and you know, like a flood, open the entire system. Okay, I got another question. I'm going to shut up.
What's the question?
Yeah, sorry. So I wrote something that I was curious after hearing you both speak. And I know that the students, and to anyone that doesn't know, I see a hand that came up, so I will step back. So Denise, we could unmute Denise and have Denise ask the question. But just quick plug for Chris's class, the new 315 in the summer that's going to be taught the second half of the summer term. If people are interested, I know the class is probably already full, but you know, people change. So if you're interested in what Chris has been talking about, it's definitely a place to learn more about you know, the migrant worker program, but Caribbean food and its connection to history in a multitude of ways. So Denise, are you there?
I'm here. I can hardly hear, but I've been unmuted, so I'm gonna utilize it. My question is, what I think is, it's like the what Dubois says, pretty much what Fanon says. We are worst enemies, honestly, because can't care come, and I know we're at a disadvantage. The global north is very powerful. However, can't we get together, the governments, and realize that we're nothing more than a plantation, regardless? Colonialism has never gone away. There's colonialism, post-colonialism, neo-colonialism, there's geo-colonialism. There's too many different types of colonialism, and too many of our people, I mean, it's like the proletariats. Whoever is in a position, each one teach one, to help the other. It's like, nope, we're just gonna just take care of ourselves and run. And it's a never-ending cycle. So my question is, because this is my passion, I would like to know how I can return to my region, problematically termed the Caribbean, how I can return to my region and make an impact, but I want to make an impact in the food industry. Because I realize here we have a problem with food security, uh, food sovereign. We have peer issues with food here. We have the same issues with food there. When are we going to get it? Because they're not going to get it for us. How are we going to get it together collectively in solidarity here and there? Because had it not been for COVID, I think too many people would have been so asleep. We're pretty much walking around like zombies. We're dead to a lot of things. COVID just, even if it's exposed certain things, it's not making it, unless you're forced to do something, there's nothing that's really going to be done, because we're the marginalized one that we the essential workers. We do everything that is important, but get no respect, no pay, no compensation, no nothing for it. So my question in a nutshell is, how do we mobilize?
Okay, I want to take that up a little bit. Thank you for your question. It's only the bold people who ask questions. Couple of things. Before I tackle your question, I want to ask the audience, the food that you eat, are you concerned whether, okay, let me start this way. It is generally said that the food that we eat can be our safest form of our medicine. The food that we eat can also be the slowest form of our poison. My question to you, are you concerned whether your food is being grown by those who respect the soil, respect the environment, and respect the workers? Or are you not concerned whether they exploit the soil, exploit the environment, exploit the workers? Now, what is food? Food in Canada is not a basic human right. Food in Canada is a commodity. It's a profit-making machine. That we need to understand. That's in Canada. That is how the Great Divide is created too. Food is, if you take Jamaica, for example, Jamaica was more or less self-sufficient in so many things. But with time, what happened? Jamaica have to import cabbage, the same basic things they could, and that is the same story in all the Caribbean, in the English-speaking Caribbean. The same basic thing that they could produce, they've been elbow out, and they have to depend on the global north for the food. Food is a weapon. Food is a weapon. How do we work around that? How do we work? That's a powerful question. That's an important question. How do we work around that? There's so many ways to skin the cat, is my opinion. There could be a radical way, and we know Cuba is one of the radical ways. Look at how Haiti have been treated, as I said earlier, and as we've been hearing. How do we work around that? There's so many ways, but awareness building is one. Awareness building is one. And how do we create awareness? There's so many tools that you can use to create awareness in our home countries. Awareness building, to me, is a fundamental one. And what do I mean by awareness building? Some people, a lot of us, we rather go to the shop and buy a pop and imported juice than the local materials that are left in our own country spoiling. Awareness building, and that is what Cuba. Again, the question is, are we being bullied into a position, or are we being resilient? Awareness building is a great tool. And we've seen examples of that in the Caribbean, where some countries do take steps to be resilient, but the fight back that they get from the global south, are we prepared to face it? These are challenging things, but these are real questions. These are practical questions. I would leave it at that. Chris, can you add your 2 cents to that?
So there's a couple of things. So before, Denise, I get to the question, I saw that Kevin asked a question about pathways. So I want to very quickly differentiate between pathways versus permanent status, right? And what the difference between pathways and a permanent status is that a pathway still leads you in a system of bondage, right? It still ties somebody to a particular situation of vulnerability. This is akin to the live-in caregiver or the caregiver program or the domestic worker, whatever the proper terminology is. So learning from our Filipino comrades and our domestic worker comrades before that, no scheme that ties a worker to a employer is what we would. Nobody should have us a waiting period, right? While that system does. Now we've had to challenge a lot of progressives and well-meaning people to say that, well, it's not fair. Some people are like, well, they're queue jumpers, right? By calling for status on arrival. Just for all of us to remember, we got a brother or sister been working 20 or 30 years in Canada. Why should they wait anymore? Number one, why or two should have people be tied to an employer, right? So why continue a system by saying about a pathway system where people are tied or indentured to labor before they get any form of labor or social mobility? Okay, so it's been important. It's been a challenge for us to talk about this stuff. Yeah, so Dutch farmers did not face any pathway system. They came as permanent residents, right? So we had that type of system put in place beforehand. And the English, at one time when they came as laborers, they also came as free people as well too. It's another way of trying to control racialized labor. And that's, I think, important for us. Now, your question, and I briefly didn't have to, and I don't have the entire answer for you, but the South Asian, the Punjabi, the Sikhs in Italy during the COVID crisis, they have set up a system to provide a permanent residency system for some people in India at this point in time. There was a Al Jazeera documentary, I believe, on that. I don't like the framing about the human trafficking component. I have a lot of concerns about that. But there is one example of a so-called pathway system. Some people will benefit from this pathway system that Canada has. But remember, it's about foundational situations to address this entire collective system of labor exploitation that needs to be addressed. It's not the individuality, right? That some are more deserving than others. Now, to Denise's question, now there's a couple of things that happened. So in 2002 or 2003, I'm never going to forget this. And there was two workers from Maypen in Jamaica who got caught with drugs. All right. And the Observer and the Gleaner had big articles. There was a big kerfuffle back then. And the response, and interestingly, there was an academic paper that came around the same time. I don't know previously or afterwards, that the entire community, all the workers from that particular community, were banned from coming up because they found drugs on two workers. Okay, now that's the first kind of outrage. The second outrage was the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States were like, yo, you know what? No problem. Punish the Jamaicans and let's bring up more people from the OACS. Okay. And I was just like, okay, this is just whack. This is absolutely wrong. So definitely there is a continued division amongst Caribbean countries. And it would be good to see type of some unity. But it's also very easy for us to basically look inwards and not look outwards, right? It's the power of the agricultural industry. It's the power of Canada over a longer period of colonial relationships, right? And economic disfigurement that we're addressing and trying to deal with here at the moment. So it's about trying to put pressure on Canada and its agricultural imperial entities. That's what I believe should be the focus. And trying to figure out ways that the CARICOM can come together through as a collective organizing, right? And the best way would be through unionization, but through a unionization process that is democratic, that is engaging, and that's ensuring that workers' interests both in the home country as well as in Canada that are represented. So it's a transnational or international model of collective bargaining that's sectoral and not based on one individual farm. So I think these are some of the transitions that we need to. And in addition, okay, now Canada has a long role and responsibility to destroying the Caribbean agricultural industries. And we have to ensure that there is sustainability and that there's resources and foundations put in place so people could take care, we can have our own self-sustaining agricultural systems, that we are not dependent on the global north. The last thing, and I think Gabriel will want to talk in, the last people I have to diss for today. So you might have also seen in the media that there was a report that came out, a systemic review around the deaths, the COVID deaths in agriculture. It came out 2 days ago. Now, justice for migrant workers, and I don't have today the time. I'm, maybe in class, if you all come to my class, if you want to heal me up, I'll give you my whole history about coroner's inquest and why it became a tactic for that I chose. And other members in Justicia separately came to choose up. But as a result of the workers who died under COVID, we had established a conversation with the coroner's office. We were promised a coroner's review, a jury of peers to develop recommendations. It's non-binding, it doesn't blame, but at least it gives a form of air of transparency and accountability. Now, during the process of advocacy last year, the coroner's office said they're not going to do it because of quote unquote resources. They set up a review. A division happened where some of us boycotted because it reneged on the original promise. Many other people took part in the process. And these type of reviews are dangerous. There's a refusal to talk about racism. There's a refusal to talk about power imbalances. How the hell can you have a conversation, a review written, and it's 30 pages, there's not one word message about race and racism, okay? The only way that they talk about workers and unpacking this idea of knowing the rights, if you don't have the right to vacation or overtime pay, it's not about knowing your rights. It's not having a culturally appropriate conversation about rights when they don't exist, okay? So the entire thing is offensive. And, a lot of well-meaning people took part in this process. And in fact, by taking part in such a process, you're legitimizing a system that continues to be racist and exclusive and has disempowered, I think, a lot of us by not addressing the core issues of what changes need to happen in the agricultural system of Ontario. Can't hear you, brother.
So I just wanted to say, Gabriel, you wanted to have the last word on this, and then we'll wrap up everything.
Yeah, thank you. To the average Canadian, when we talk about status, to the average Canadian, status means being landed, staying in Canada. That's not what status means to a migrant worker. Status is that one thing. That is that one thing that helps us to have an open work permit. It takes the pressure off me, the migrant worker, and it puts it on my employer. Being tied to my employer, being tied to my employer being tied to my employer and being denied basic human rights, basic labor standard, that is the problem. By having status, it gives me an open work permit. By having an open work permit, it puts the pressure on my employer to create a condition that will attract me and keep me. That is what status means to a migrant worker. Status is that thing, that one thing that would help us to access decent work, to access equality, to access fairness. That is what status means to us. To the average Canadian, status means being citizenship and being landed and all. That's not what it means to us. It means that, yes, we're not taking that away, but it means the working and living condition is just transformed. And in closing, I want to say a couple of things. I didn't have the time to say that. I said I'm a God, an angel, everything, but I'll just use the word angel for now. My name is Gabriel. Some people have turned me, and I'm from the Caribbean, you all know, because of colonialism and Christianity, they've turned me to an angel. They've made the heaven on earth, and they've turned me to use my labor to make their heaven on earth. Am I going to be a spectator, or am I going to be a player? And in closing, I want to tell you, when I look at the flag of Canada, I was trying to tell you my story, but not enough time. Red and white means love in my country. And I felt the love of Canada on 2 occasions. I don't have time to tell you that now. But red alone in my home country, red means danger. When I see a leaf, to me, a leaf should be green. In school, we are taught the leaf is that factory where our food is being synthesized, right? But when I see a red leaf, it reminds me of the 20 injustices. It reminds me of the danger that migrant farm workers face every day in the production of your food that we put on your table. My question to you is, there's power in your hands. Today, I'm hoping this session will help you to examine that. In your hands, there's power. As a consumer, there's power. As a student, there's power. As a voter, and the skills that you have, there's power. Are you going to use those power? Discover that power that you have and use it to push for a better world, a fair world. Because all the injustices are PPP. Our poverty in Canada is because of the unjust policies of the politician. You have the power in your hands to push the politician to create a fair world. Thank you.
Okay, now I'm not mute, but I just wanted to thank you all. I know there's a lot of applause that is coming from across Zoom, it is not always there, but I could just tell from the chat and how enthusiastic everyone was in terms of the presentation and the keynote. We just wanted to thank you all on behalf of Caribbean Studies. We look forward to have you back. And also, Gabriel, thank you for being so generous with your time in terms of even taking students' questions and helping with interviews and stuff like that. So I just wanted to shout you out with that as well, that, you're a real friend of the program. Obviously, Chris, you are too. But we really appreciate you taking the time to do this. So just in terms of wrapping up, I know it's been a long day. Thank you for staying online for what is a full day, and for sticking with us when things got a bit tricky and dicey at the beginning. But it's a pleasure to put this on, and I can speak proudly and confidently on behalf of all the faculty and professors that it's our pleasure to see these kinds of events come together, right? Because there's not too many spaces where we're able to do that, and to have a full day where you're all able to shine and really we can celebrate your work. It makes it really, really it hits home as someone that's an educator about why we do this kind of stuff. So I mentioned at the beginning, this is one of the reasons why I have a lot of hope, and genuinely all of you that are on the call right now, and those of you that have logged off as well, it's very, very inspiring to see the next generation of people come up and the great ideas you have, but also these plans about putting them into practice. So just before I log off, I wanted to thank Janae again for doing all that incredible work for many months to make this happen. So I wanted to give a shout out to her very, very much for working with me, and also putting me on the right direction when it came to making sure I was paying attention and focusing on stuff. She made sure all the everything was on track and had the timeline. So really, really incredible. Thank you for that. I wanted to thank Annetta, who went above and beyond, and also to Michaela, the two librarians at New College, who were very, very responsive in helping us get this going. It wasn't just today they were helping us, but going back weeks, and that's really helpful. And you all were super quick on figuring out ways how to deal with the interruptions we had at the beginning. And I think you helped to save a lot of the morale and spirit that we had in the conference. So thank you both for that. And just thank you again to New College for giving us the initiative funding that we were able to have this happen this year. And hopefully we will continue it next year. So everyone that is on the call right now, I know a lot of you are students, but those of you that are not, please just drop into the chat if you'd be interested in being on the Caribbean Studies listserv, so we could keep you up to date with events. We also have the Facebook page, and we will be chopping this up and editing it to make smaller snippets that will be on our new YouTube channel. Aside from that, Professor Rodriguez, you are still here. Or Janae, if you wanted to say anything, I'm not going to put you on the spot. But if you're there, if you wanted to say anything, or Professor Rodriguez, so that we could close up.
I just want to say thank you guys for coming. I wasn't sure how many people would come. Granted, I know everybody's might be a little tired of online conferences or just meeting online, but I think this is actually a great opportunity. And I'm really also proud of the work that my fellow students are doing. I'm always impressed about how smart you guys are and how engaged and critical you are. So it makes me very hopeful for the future. And thank you to the keynotes and the panel chairs as well. And you, Professor Kevin. Okay, bye.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Well, I just want to add to what Janae has said. I mean, Kevin, this has been a wonderful event. And I know that you have a whole team behind you, but you are the one who is putting everything together, and it's all the kudos for you. So I learned a lot today. All of the panels were amazing, and I hope to have the capacity to organize something like this next year. And I'm sure that you will have to help me figure out how to do it. But this has been amazing. So thank you very much.
No problem. And thank you all for, like I said, for joining us. And we have a great model that's put in place, so we can be tweaked, and hopefully we can run it back again. So be safe, everyone. I know there's a lot going on. We have Judy who mentioned that there's the event happening. We'll have that on the Caribbean Studies Facebook page if people wanted to check that out. I know it's been a long day with all the events, but Professor Howman with the book, also the charity on the ground in St. Vincent, we're going to pass that along, as well as all of the other things that have come through in terms of the petition for justice for migrant workers and all of that. So I'm going to send a wrap out email to everyone that's here just to close up. But aside from that, we will call it a day. Thank you all. I'm very lucky to work with you, and this went very well. So I'm very lucky. I like my